If you ask Americans where the nation's wealth truly came from, many will point to the stories they learned in school. They might talk about the steel empire of Andrew Carnegie, or the oil dominance of John D. Rockefeller, or the railroad networks financed by J.P. Morgan. Others will speak about brilliant inventors like Thomas Edison or Henry Ford, who reshaped technology and industry. And of course, some will mention presidents, legislators, and national leaders whose decisions guided the country through booms, recessions, and global conflicts. But behind every familiar story, there is a quieter truth. The American superpower was not built only by giants. It was built by ordinary people, millions of them. Families who lived paycheck to paycheck. Men and women who worked long hours in hot factories, cold fields, and crowded workshops. People who never saw their names printed in a textbook, but whose labor powered the rise of an economy unlike anything the world had ever seen. This is the hidden history of American wealth. A story that almost never appears in school lessons, yet defines the real foundation of the United States. A story that begins not in the halls of Congress or in corporate boardrooms, but in cramped tenements, dusty mining towns, and crowded industrial neighborhoods where entire families struggled just to stay afloat. At the start of the 20th century, America was bursting with energy and contradiction. Cities were expanding at unprecedented speed. Factories multiplied across the landscape. Steam engines roared, railroads snaked across the continent, and electric wires began lighting the night sky. It was a time of innovation, a time of ambition, a time of great promise. But it was also a time of hardship. Because for every story of wealth, there were hundreds of stories of struggle. Millions of workers earned barely enough to survive. Immigrant families shared tiny apartments, sometimes with multiple families squeezed into a single space. Children worked in mines and mills because their parents needed the extra income. Women took in laundry or sewing to support their households. Men worked 10 or 12 hours a day doing dangerous, exhausting labor. The idea of a stable middle class, a family with savings, a home education, and security was far beyond reach for most Americans in 1900. And yet, even in these difficult conditions, something remarkable was happening. Ordinary workers were laying the groundwork for the nation's future wealth. Not through grand inventions or massive fortunes or political power, but through constant, steady effort. Their labor kept the factories running. Their hands laid railroad tracks that connected cities and markets. Their work filled the mines with coal that powered industry. Their skills built the machines that would define modern manufacturing. These were not glamorous contributions, but they were essential. Without them, the American economy would never have taken the leap from a developing nation into an industrial powerhouse. The United States did not rise because a few wealthy men made brilliant decisions. It rose because millions of families were willing to endure hardship, to work relentlessly, and to chase the possibility of a better life. Scarcity shaped their determination. For many of these families, there was no safety net. There was no government support. There were no unemployment benefits, no health insurance, and few pensions. If a worker was injured, their family suffered. If a worker lost their job, they had to find a new one immediately. If the economy slowed, entire neighborhoods plunged into uncertainty. And yet these families kept saving. Even tiny amounts mattered. A few coins hidden in a tin box under the bed. A single dollar set aside for an emergency. Money scraped together to help a child stay in school instead of joining the workforce too early. Every small act of saving and sacrifice strengthened the economic foundation of the country. The rise of America was not built on the extravagance of the wealthy, but on the discipline of ordinary people who understood the value of every cent they earned. They lived frugally. They shared resources with neighbors. They built churches, clubs, and community organizations that provided informal support long before the government did. They pooled money to help newcomers find jobs. They opened small shops, bought used tools, and started tiny businesses that created local economies. And in doing so, they planted the seeds of the middle class long before the middle class officially existed. While industrialists captured headlines, it was working families who created the true momentum behind American growth. It was the factory worker perfecting their speed on the assembly line, the seamstress sewing clothes for a booming population, the miner hauling coal under dangerous conditions, the construction worker raising buildings that would reshape the skyline, the immigrant mother preparing food late into the night to earn a few extra coins, the rural farmer harvesting crops despite unstable prices and unpredictable weather. These efforts may have seemed small, but together they formed an economic engine so powerful that it would one day support the wealthiest nation on earth. This story is not about dramatic moments. It is not about sudden breakthroughs. It is about millions of people doing ordinary things with extraordinary consistency. Their contributions were often invisible. They rarely received recognition. But they built the roads. They wired the cities. They constructed the factories. They staffed the mills. They powered the steam engines. They laid the bricks. They delivered the goods. They grew the food. They turned labor into stability and stability into national wealth. America's rise began with people who had almost nothing, no savings, no security, and very little opportunity. But what they did have was determination. And that determination multiplied across millions of families, created the foundation for prosperity. This early period raises an important question. How did ordinary families with limited education, low wages, and few legal protections play such a crucial role in building a global superpower? To answer that, we must go back to the early 20th century in detail, to a country filled with ambition and inequality, to a people who believed in progress despite the odds, and to everyday workers whose hands, sweat, and sacrifice became the true foundation of American wealth. This is where our story begins. Not with presidents or tycoons, but with ordinary Americans who built a nation from the bottom up. At the turn of the 20th century, America was a magnet for people chasing possibility. They came from Italy, Ireland, Germany, Russia, Poland, China, Japan, and dozens of other places. They arrived tired, hungry, and often carrying everything they owned in a single bag. Many had left behind political chaos. Some had escaped famine. Others fled poverty, violence, or rigid social systems that offered little hope for a better life. But the one thing they all shared was belief. Belief that America, even with all its uncertainty, offered a chance to build something new. When these immigrants stepped onto American soil, they did not enter a land of comfort. They entered a land of work. Hard work. Uncertain work. Work that often demanded physical strength, long hours, and enormous sacrifice. Yet this wave of newcomers would become one of the most powerful economic engines in the nation's history. Not because they were wealthy, but because they were willing to do what the country needed most: fill the labor force, expand industries, and drive the early stages of American economic growth. This is the story of that transformation, how newcomers helped build the wealth of a nation long before they ever experienced stability themselves. Immigration shaped every major city. New York became a mosaic of ethnic neighborhoods: Little Italy, the Lower East Side Harlem Chinatown. Chicago grew into a powerhouse of steel meatpacking and railroads. Boston, Philadelphia, and San Francisco expanded rapidly as new workers arrived each day. Factories needed labor. Railroads needed labor. Mines needed labor. Construction needed labor. And immigration provided it. Millions of people arrived ready to take the hardest jobs, the lowest wages, and the longest hours. It was difficult, dangerous, and often brutal. Many immigrants lived in tenements, tall, narrow buildings crammed with families. A single room might house 5, 6, or even 10 people. Bathrooms were shared by entire floors. Food was scarce. Disease spread easily. And yet, despite these conditions, immigrant neighborhoods pulsed with energy. You could hear dozens of languages on a single street. Smells of unfamiliar spices filled the air. Local markets sold food from every corner of the world. Strangers helped one another translate job listings, find cheap apartments, or borrow money to get started. These communities created informal social safety nets long before government support existed. People relied on churches, mutual aid societies, and cultural associations to survive their first difficult years in America. Immigrant families lived modestly. They saved aggressively. Pennies were precious. Every unnecessary purchase was avoided. And with each paycheck, they slowly built stability. But their greatest contribution was the labor they provided. Labor that powered industrial America. Immigrants helped build railroads that connected the East Coast to the West. They worked in steel mills that produced the beams used in new skyscrapers. They staffed meatpacking plants in Chicago, coal mines in Pennsylvania, textile factories in New England, and canneries along the Pacific coast. Their effort increased output, lowered costs, and fueled the rise of mass production, the backbone of America's early wealth. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't celebrated. But it mattered. Because without this labor force, the United States would never have experienced the explosive growth that defined the early 20th century. Immigrants also brought skills. Many were craftsmen, tailors, carpenters, shoemakers, bakers, metalworkers. Others brought farming techniques that improved agriculture across the Midwest. Still others brought cultural knowledge, business instincts, and entrepreneurial spirit. Contrary to popular belief, immigrants did not simply take jobs. They created them. Thousands eventually opened small businesses, grocery stores, repair shops, restaurants, tailoring houses, bakeries. These businesses became anchors of local communities and vital pieces of the nation's economic network. Children of immigrants often played a key role in this growth. Many were the first in their families to attend school regularly. They learned English quickly. They helped parents navigate paperwork, negotiate wages, or avoid scams. They carried a deep sense of obligation, a desire to lift their families out of poverty, and a belief that education was the path forward. These children would become the teachers, engineers, factory supervisors, nurses, and professionals who strengthened the emerging middle class. But before that happened, immigrant families had to endure decades of economic volatility. Wages were inconsistent. Employment was unstable. Accidents were common. A single injury could ruin a family. A factory closure could force people to move overnight. And then came discrimination. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe faced suspicion. Asian immigrants faced exclusion. Irish and Italian workers encountered hostility from established groups. Anti-immigrant sentiment spread during recessions as political leaders blamed newcomers for problems caused by inequality and exploitation. Despite all this, immigrants kept working. They pushed through hardship. They adapted. They pursued opportunity wherever they could find it. And slowly their labor transformed the economy. Every railroad built, every building constructed, every ton of steel produced, every machine assembled, expanded America's wealth. These contributions combined into something massive, a national economic engine powered by people who began with nothing. Yet there was something deeper, something beyond physical labor that immigrants gave to the United States. They gave the country a mindset of ambition, a mindset of resilience, a mindset that believed progress was possible even when times were hard. This belief spread across cities, towns, and rural communities. It shaped expectations. It powered innovation. It fueled risk-taking. It encouraged ordinary families to strive for more than survival. Immigrants helped redefine what Americans believed was achievable. They introduced new foods, new traditions, and new perspectives. They broadened culture. They expanded political coalitions. They created an America that was more diverse, more dynamic, and more driven toward growth. By 1920, immigrants and their children made up nearly half of the workforce in major industrial cities. They provided the labor force that fueled economic expansion. They built the infrastructure that connected the nation. They strengthened the consumer base that would one day support a thriving middle class. But in the early decades, they did not live middle-class lives. They lived on the edge of poverty, saving every cent, working tirelessly, and hoping that the next generation would experience the stability they never had. This hope, combined with their relentless effort, became a crucial foundation of America's wealth. Their sacrifices allowed the country to build the industries, the infrastructure, and the economic system that would eventually lift millions into the middle class. The superpower America became was shaped not just by leaders and magnates, but by immigrants who paved its roads, worked its factories, mined its resources, and built its cities. They were the nation's first great workforce, the silent architects of economic expansion, the early builders of American wealth. And their story reminds us of a simple truth. A nation's strength is not measured only by its heroes, its rich or its powerful, but by the millions of ordinary people who show up every day, work hard, and push a society forward. The immigrant engine powered America's first wave of growth. But another transformation was coming, one that would reorganize work itself and redefine what ordinary families could achieve. To understand how that happened, we must look at the next chapter: the rise of mass production and the new economic forces that would reshape the country forever. At the beginning of the 20th century, America was still a nation of contrast, a place filled with opportunity yet defined by instability. A place where innovation was accelerating, yet millions of families lived one paycheck away from disaster. But something was changing. Quietly at first, then rapidly. The way Americans worked was being transformed by a new force powerful enough to reshape the entire economy. That force was mass production. The idea was simple. If you could build products faster, more efficiently, and in enormous quantities, you could dramatically lower costs. And if costs fell, ordinary people, not just the wealthy, could afford goods that once seemed impossible. This idea would not only reinvent factories, it would reinvent society. It would create new jobs, new skills, new expectations, and eventually the first real pathway to middle-class life. At the center of this transformation stood Henry Ford. Ford did not invent the automobile. He did not invent the factory. And he certainly did not invent the worker. What he did invent was a system that zoomed in on efficiency with unprecedented focus. Before Ford, automobiles were luxury items, machines built slowly by skilled craftsmen with unique parts made individually. A car was something only the wealthy could dream of owning. Ford believed this could change. He imagined a world where a car could be built quickly, with standardized parts, and sold to ordinary workers, including his own employees. To turn this dream into reality, Ford needed a new method of production, a method that would transform manufacturing just as dramatically as electricity had transformed cities. In 1913, at his Highland Park plant in Michigan, Ford introduced the moving assembly line. Here is how it worked. Instead of having workers move around to assemble a car, the car moved to the workers. Each worker performed a single, simple task: a bolt tightened, a wheel installed, a wire connected, a motion repeated over and over hundreds of times a day. This system cut the time required to build a Model T from 12 hours to 90 minutes. The increase in efficiency was staggering, and with efficiency came lower costs. The price of the Model T dropped year after year. Suddenly, a product once reserved for the wealthy was within reach of the working class. Families who had once traveled by horse could afford a car. Farmers could move goods faster. Workers could seek jobs farther from home. The automobile became not just a machine, but a tool of liberation. But Ford's innovation went beyond the assembly line. In 1914, he shocked the business world by announcing the $5 workday, a wage far higher than what most factories paid. Critics thought Ford was reckless. They claimed no company could survive if it paid workers that much. Ford saw something they didn't. A workforce that could buy what it built would strengthen the economy. A worker who could afford a car was not just an employee. He was a customer. He was the proof that prosperity could expand. Higher wages reduced turnover. Productivity increased. Efficiency soared. And the world took notice. Factories across the United States began copying Ford's methods. Factories that once relied on skilled craftsmen shifted to assembly lines, breaking complex tasks into smaller, manageable steps. This change allowed companies to hire workers with limited experience, train them quickly, and produce goods in massive quantities. This new labor model expanded opportunity. Immigrants who spoke little English could find stable work. Rural families moving to the city could secure predictable wages. Young people with no specialized training could learn on the job. Mass production opened the door to millions of jobs that offered regular hours, consistent pay, and the earliest form of economic security many workers had ever experienced. Factories multiplied across the country. Automobiles, refrigerators, radios, furniture, tools. Each industry adopted mass production to meet the growing demand of a rising consumer society. With increasing output came falling prices. Goods that once symbolized wealth became accessible. A family could buy a sewing machine, a stove, a washing tub, a bicycle. These items did more than improve daily life. They shaped a new identity, a sense that comfort, technology, and convenience were not luxuries. They were becoming normal. And with this shift came a powerful psychological change. Ordinary families began to believe that progress was possible, that the future could be better than the past. But mass production also had costs. The work was repetitive, monotonous, physically demanding. Workers performed the same motions hundreds or thousands of times a day. Injuries were common. Exhaustion was real. The system valued efficiency above all else. People were expected to match the pace of machines. This tension between efficiency and humanity would later spark labor movements, strikes, and political battles that reshaped the workplace for decades. But in the early 20th century, mass production was a revolution. It created millions of jobs. It lowered prices on essential goods. It expanded access to technology. And most importantly, it linked wages and consumption in a way the world had never seen. The American worker was no longer just a producer. He became a consumer. And consumer spending became one of the engines of national wealth. This connection between production and consumption is what allowed ordinary families to slowly accumulate buying power. For the first time, people could save money not just for emergencies, but for improvement. Better homes, better furniture, better food, better clothing, better opportunities for their children. This change created a ripple effect across society. Cities grew as workers moved closer to factories. Public transportation expanded. Businesses sprang up near industrial centers. Schools grew to serve the swelling population. Banks offered credit to families with steady jobs. Mass production did not only build goods, it built confidence. It built infrastructure. It built the early stages of economic mobility. And slowly, the idea of a middle-class life became more than a dream. It became attainable, at least for some. But mass production also exposed deep inequalities. Not all groups benefited equally. Women were often restricted to the lowest-paying positions. Black Americans faced discrimination and exclusion from many factories. Immigrant workers were paid less and faced hostility from native-born workers. Still, despite these injustices, mass production laid the groundwork for a more inclusive economy. It created jobs on a scale America had never seen. It raised income levels. It accelerated urban growth. It reshaped consumption. And it introduced millions of families to the first steps of financial security. But this new economic engine was about to collide with forces more powerful than efficiency, innovation, or ambition. As the United States marched into the 1920s, production surged, prices fell, consumerism flourished, optimism soared. People believed the good times would last forever. They believed the future had no limits. They believed the country had discovered a formula for endless prosperity. They were wrong. The same system that created abundance had created instability. And by the end of the decade, America would confront a collapse so severe that it would redefine everything wealth, work, government, and the meaning of opportunity itself. But before that collapse, the nation would experience one of the most dramatic chapters in its economic history. Roaring Twenties, a decade of excitement, excess, and illusions of limitless growth. That story comes next. By the early 1920s, America felt like it was stepping into a new world. A world lit by electric light, filled with modern machines, and energized by a sense of momentum no generation had experienced before. Cities glowed at night. Factories hummed with activity. Jazz spilled out of crowded clubs. And everywhere you looked, there was a feeling that the future had finally arrived. It was exciting. It was loud. It was intoxicating. But most importantly, it was misleading. Because beneath the glitter of prosperity, the United States was building a fragile system, one powered by credit speculation and optimism that had drifted far from reality. A system destined to collapse. To understand the rise of American wealth, we must understand the Roaring Twenties, not just as a decade of celebration, but as a decade where everyday families finally tasted modern prosperity while unknowingly walking toward an economic cliff. The decade began with technological transformation. Electricity was spreading rapidly across urban America. In just a few years, city households gained access to electric lighting, refrigerators, washing machines, and radios. Electricity did more than power devices. It reshaped daily life. Families stayed awake later. Evenings were filled with music, news, and entertainment through radio broadcasts. Household labor became easier. Shopping hours extended into the night. People moved through cities with new energy, a rhythm that felt modern, fast, and unstoppable. Automobiles took this transformation even further. Ford's Model T dominated the road, but new companies entered the market: Chevrolet, Dodge, Chrysler. For the first time, a working-class family could imagine owning a car. A car meant freedom. A car meant access to new neighborhoods, better schools, and weekend trips into the countryside. A car symbolized upward mobility. It was more than a machine. It was a promise. As technology advanced, consumer demand exploded. Factories ramped up production. Workers earned slightly higher wages than before. Businesses expanded. Cities grew. And all of this created a new kind of America, a consumer America. For decades, most families had spent money only on necessities: food, rent, basic clothing, fuel for heating. But in the 1920s, advertising reinvented desire. Companies hired psychologists to study why people bought things. They used images, symbols, and emotional appeals to connect products with identity. A refrigerator wasn't just a kitchen appliance. It was progress. A radio wasn't just entertainment. It was belonging to a nation that now shared culture in real time. A car wasn't just transportation. It was status, freedom, modernity. This shift marked the birth of consumerism, the belief that buying things was central to living a good life. But there was one problem. Even with rising wages, most families still couldn't afford the new goods that filled store windows. So companies created a solution: installment credit. Instead of paying up front, a family could buy now and pay later a few dollars each week, a few dollars each month. It felt like magic. It felt like opportunity. It felt like the future. A factory worker who earned modest wages could suddenly afford a radio, a sewing machine, even a car. A housewife could buy an electric washer that saved hours of labor each day. But with each purchase, debt quietly grew. Debt became normal. Debt became invisible. And for the first time in American history, household spending exceeded household income. Yet few people worried. Everything felt stable. Jobs were plentiful. Prices were low. Factories were busy. And technology was improving so quickly that many believed prosperity was unstoppable. Even economists and politicians declared that recessions were becoming a thing of the past. This confidence spread to Wall Street. By the mid-1920s, ordinary Americans were investing in the stock market for the first time. People who had never imagined owning shares were now buying stocks on margin borrowing money to invest, hoping to get rich quickly. Newspapers encouraged the trend. Financial magazines glamorized speculation. Bankers reassured the public that the market would always rise. It became a national obsession, a fever that blurred logic and replaced caution with excitement. Stock prices soared. Companies inflated their value. Speculation drove markets higher and higher, creating the illusion that wealth could expand forever without consequences. But this was only one side of America. The other side remained invisible to many. Rural communities were suffering. Crop prices had collapsed as global competition increased. Farmers sank into debt. Many lost their land. Factory workers often faced seasonal layoffs. Immigrants and minorities encountered discrimination that limited their access to opportunity. Families living outside major cities rarely saw the full benefits of technological progress. Even within cities, wealth was concentrated in a small group. Income inequality widened. The top 1% of Americans controlled more wealth than the bottom 40% combined. But the illusion of prosperity was powerful enough to mask these cracks. Throughout the decade, production soared. Consumption surged. Cities grew upward and outward. Cars filled the roads. Radios filled living rooms. Jazz filled the air. America felt modern and modernity felt permanent. Yet the basic structure of the economy was becoming increasingly unstable. Factories produced more goods than people could afford. Farmers produced more crops than markets could absorb. Consumers bought items on credit they couldn't pay back. Investors poured borrowed money into an overheated stock market. The system depended on constant growth in production, growth in consumption, growth in confidence. But confidence is fragile. And when it breaks, everything collapses. By the late 1920s, warning signs were everywhere. Industrial output began to slow. Home construction declined. Consumer debt reached dangerous levels. Farm bankruptcies surged. Stock prices became detached from reality. Yet the excitement of the decade made it difficult for people to see the danger. They were too caught up in the rhythm of prosperity. The music was too loud. The lights were too bright. The promise of easy wealth was too intoxicating. And then in the fall of 1929, the illusion shattered. The stock market collapsed. Billions of dollars evaporated in days. Banks failed. Factories closed. Millions lost their jobs. The same system that had created wealth had also created vulnerability. The same tools that brought opportunity, credit, mass production, consumer spending had amplified the shock when the system failed. The Roaring Twenties had not been a golden age. They had been a high-speed race toward a cliff no one wanted to see. But hidden within that collapse was something important. A lesson. A recognition that prosperity built on illusion cannot last. And that lesson would shape the next chapter of American history, a chapter where ordinary families would suffer deeply while the nation searched for a new path forward. The Great Depression was coming, and it would forever change the meaning of wealth, work, and opportunity in America. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, most Americans did not realize that their entire way of life was about to collapse. To many, the crash looked like a crisis for wealthy investors, a problem for bankers, a financial shock to the people who played with numbers on Wall Street. But within weeks, the pain spread far beyond the stock exchange. It rippled outward into factories, farms, shops, and neighborhoods. It hit families who had never owned a single share of stock. It struck workers who had never seen the inside of a bank. It crushed communities that had nothing to do with speculation. The Great Depression did not simply erase wealth. It erased confidence. It shattered the belief that progress was guaranteed and prosperity permanent. And in doing so, it forced America to rethink what wealth really meant and who it should serve. When the crash began, millions of families went from stability to uncertainty almost overnight. Factories closed, businesses failed, banks collapsed and took people's savings with them. There was no deposit insurance. When a bank failed, your life savings simply disappeared. One day it was there. The next day it was gone. The collapse triggered panic. People lined up outside banks begging to withdraw whatever money remained. Many got nothing. By 1932, 1 out of every 4 Americans was unemployed. That meant 1 in 4 families had no paycheck, no safety net, no way to buy food or pay rent. Cities were overwhelmed. Soup kitchens stretched for blocks. Bread lines filled with men who once had steady work and stable lives. Families moved into makeshift shelters built from scrap metal and discarded wood. These shanty towns were nicknamed Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the disaster. For millions of Americans, poverty was no longer a distant threat. It was the new reality. But the Great Depression did more than break financial systems. It broke the idea that the economy could regulate itself. For decades, politicians had argued that the government should stay out of markets, that business leaders knew best, that the system would correct itself. The Depression exposed that belief as an illusion. Markets did not fix themselves. Businesses did not protect workers. Banks did not safeguard people's savings. The existing system collapsed under its own weight, and ordinary people paid the price. But the crisis also revealed a deeper truth that wealth in America had always been fragile when built on speculation, debt, and inequality. The prosperity of the 1920s had looked strong, but it rested on unstable foundations. Factories produced more goods than families could afford. Consumers bought on credit they could not repay. Farmers harvested crops that sold for less than the cost of production. Investors borrowed money to gamble in the stock market. When confidence disappeared, the entire system collapsed like a house of cards. The Depression forced the country to confront a painful reality. Ordinary Americans had built the nation through their labor, their sacrifice, and their optimism. Yet they were the ones who suffered the most when the system failed. This injustice created anger, frustration, and a demand for change. Families who had done everything right found themselves punished for mistakes made by elites. The nation was emotionally exhausted, financially devastated, and socially divided. But as the crisis deepened, something important began to emerge. The understanding that the government had a role to play in protecting citizens from the failures of markets. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the presidency in 1932, he inherited a country on the edge of collapse. Banks were failing by the day, factories were silent, confidence was gone. But Roosevelt brought something powerful: belief. Belief that government could act. Belief that society could be rebuilt. Belief that ordinary people deserved protection. In his famous inauguration speech, he told the nation, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Roosevelt understood something critical. The Depression was not just an economic crisis. It was a psychological crisis. People needed hope. People needed direction. People needed proof that the government stood with them. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt launched a wave of reforms unlike anything the country had ever seen. These programs became known as the New Deal. The Emergency Banking Act stabilized the financial system by closing failed banks and restoring trust in the ones that remained. The creation of the FDIC finally protected people's savings, a guarantee that a bank failure would never again wipe out a family's life savings. The Securities and Exchange Commission regulated the stock market to prevent the reckless speculation that had fueled the crash. Public works programs hired millions of unemployed Americans to build roads, bridges, dams, schools, and public buildings. The country's infrastructure was rebuilt by people who only months earlier stood in breadlines. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work restoring forests, building trails, and revitalizing national parks. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity to rural regions that had been left behind by modernization. These programs did more than create jobs. They restored dignity. They gave people purpose. They proved that the nation had not abandoned them. But the most transformative shift was philosophical. The New Deal introduced the idea that economic security was a right, not a privilege. This led to one of the most important laws in American history, the Social Security Act of 1935. Before Social Security, old age meant fear. Without savings or pensions, many elderly Americans were forced into poverty. Some lost their homes. Others depended entirely on their children. Social Security changed that. It established a system where workers contributed during their careers and received support in retirement. For the first time, millions of Americans could look toward old age without fear of destitution. Unemployment insurance was also created. Losing a job no longer meant immediate disaster. There was now a safety net. These reforms reshaped the economic foundations of America. They created stability where none had existed before. They allowed families to save, plan, and invest in the future. And while the New Deal did not end the Depression overnight, it gave the country the tools it needed to rebuild. It shifted the balance of power toward ordinary people. It acknowledged that workers were essential to the nation's strength. Most importantly, it laid the foundation for the middle class that would emerge after World War II. The Great Depression was catastrophic. It caused suffering on a scale few generations have experienced. It exposed inequalities that had festered for decades. It forced families to reinvent their lives in ways that were painful and permanent. But it also sparked a transformation, a recognition that wealth must serve the people, not the other way around. The Depression tore America apart. The New Deal helped put it back together. And just as the country began to recover, a global conflict would ignite the greatest economic boom in American history. World War II was about to change everything. When the United States entered World War II, in December 1941, the country was still emerging from the shadows of the Great Depression. Millions had regained work through New Deal programs, but the economy remained fragile. Factories were not running at full capacity. Wages were improving, but many families were still recovering from years of scarcity. No one could have predicted that a global conflict, a tragedy on a scale the world had never seen, would become the catalyst for the greatest economic transformation in American history. And yet, that is exactly what happened. World War II did not just reshape the world politically. It reshaped America economically, technologically, and socially. It created opportunities that had never existed before. It unleashed an industrial miracle so massive that it elevated ordinary families into new levels of stability and prosperity. It turned the United States into the world's unquestioned economic superpower, and in doing so, it provided the final missing piece for the rise of the modern American middle class. When the war began, the U.S. government faced a monumental challenge. It needed weapons, vehicles, ships, ammunition, and supplies on a scale never attempted in human history. Factories that once built refrigerators, cars, and farm equipment were suddenly asked to build tanks, bombers, and warships. Companies that had never produced weapons were hired to make ammunition and aircraft parts. America's industrial engine came alive with unprecedented force. The numbers still seem impossible. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, More than 100,000 tanks, millions of rifles, billions of bullets, and thousands of ships. Factories ran non-stop. Some operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This scale of production was so extraordinary that historians later called the United States the arsenal of democracy. But behind this patriotic slogan were millions of ordinary Americans whose lives were transformed by the opportunity the war created. For the first time in more than a decade, unemployment vanished. Virtually every able-bodied adult could find work, and not just any work, but well-paid, stable, consistent employment. People who had once stood in bread lines were now building engines, riveting metal plates, operating cranes, and managing assembly lines. Wages rose, hourly pay increased. Overtime became common. Families saved money for the first time in their lives. The war economy also broke old social barriers. Before the conflict, women were often expected to stay at home. Many jobs were restricted to men only. But with millions of men serving overseas, factories needed labor, and they needed it fast. Women stepped into these roles with determination and skill. Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of this transformation. She represented the millions of women who built airplanes, welded ships, designed machinery, and operated heavy equipment. For the first time, women earned their own paychecks in huge numbers. They gained independence, confidence, and a sense of capability that would influence American society for decades. The war also opened doors for Black Americans, immigrants, and minorities long excluded from well-paid industrial work. Although discrimination persisted, the pressure for labor forced factories to hire more diversely. Executive Order 8802, issued by President Roosevelt, prohibited racial discrimination in defense industries. This policy did not solve inequality, but it created new pathways for thousands of families seeking better opportunities. Entire regions of this country were transformed by wartime production. Detroit, once the car capital of the world, became the tank capital of the world. Los Angeles exploded in size as defense factories lined the West Coast. Shipyards in California, Washington, and Virginia produced vessels at unprecedented speed. Cities grew, new neighborhoods emerged, schools expanded, infrastructure improved. The war economy was not just a temporary surge, it was a permanent expansion of America's industrial capacity. Technology also accelerated at a pace never seen before. Radar, plastics, jet engines, synthetic rubber, penicillin, early computing machines. All of these innovations were driven forward by wartime necessity. After the war, these technologies moved into civilian life, fueling new industries, new jobs, and new economic growth. But the most profound transformation was psychological. For more than a decade, Americans had lived with fear of unemployment, fear of poverty, fear of instability. During the war, something changed. People worked, people saved, people built. They gained confidence not just in themselves, but in the future. Rationing limited consumer goods. But that did not reduce optimism, it intensified anticipation. People saved money because they could not spend it. They dreamed of buying homes, cars, appliances, and furniture when the war ended, and they believed that better days were coming. But the war did something else, something that would transform the structure of American society forever. It created the conditions for government policy to expand opportunity on an unprecedented scale. In 1944, Congress passed the GI Bill. This single law would become one of the most powerful engines of middle-class growth in world history. The GI Bill offered returning veterans low-cost home loans, college tuition, job training, and unemployment benefits. For millions of soldiers, these benefits meant a fresh start and access to opportunities that had previously been reserved for the wealthy. The GI Bill democratized education. It democratized home ownership. It democratized upward mobility. When combined with wartime savings, full employment, and technological expansion, it provided the final pieces necessary to create the largest middle class the world had ever seen. By the end of the war in 1945, America controlled half of all global industrial output. It held the majority of the world's gold reserves. Its factories were modern, powerful, and ready to shift from wartime production to consumer goods. The world's major economies, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, France, were devastated. The United States stood alone as the economic leader of the post-war world. But the real story is not about numbers, it is about families. Ordinary families who had been poor or unstable in the 1930s now had savings. They had steady work histories. They had access to education. They had government-backed loans that made homeownership possible. They had confidence that the future would be brighter than the past. The war did not create the middle class, but it created the conditions that made the middle class inevitable. It aligned government policy, industrial power, labor demand, and family ambition in a way that had never happened before and might never happen again. The arsenal of democracy had built more than weapons. It had built the foundation of the modern American dream, and when the soldiers returned home, they would ignite a demographic and economic explosion that would transform the United States from an industrial giant into a middle-class nation. When World War II ended in 1945, millions of American soldiers returned home to a country overflowing with expectation. They stepped off troop ships and trains, not into a broken nation, but into one ready to explode with opportunity. Fear had defined the 1930s. Sacrifice had defined the early 1940s. But now, for the first time in decades, hope defined the future. And that hope was powered by a single piece of legislation. A law so transformative that historians still call it the greatest wealth-building program in world history. It was officially known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. But most Americans remember it by a different name, the GI Bill. This one policy rewrote the economic landscape of the United States. It democratized education, democratized home ownership, and democratized prosperity in ways that reshaped the country for generations. The GI Bill was created to prevent a repeat of what happened after World War I. When the earlier war ended, millions of veterans came home to unemployment, poverty, and frustration. The government feared the same thing would happen in 1945, but on a much larger scale. So the GI Bill became the solution. A promise that the nation would not abandon the people who had served it. A promise that returning soldiers would have a pathway to stability, opportunity, and upward mobility. The most powerful part of the GI Bill was its educational benefits. Before the war, college was a luxury. Most Americans never considered it. Tuition was expensive. Campuses were small. Higher education was reserved for the wealthy or the academically elite. But after the GI Bill, everything changed. Veterans received free tuition, textbook support, and a living allowance while they studied. This meant that millions of young men struggling to imagine their futures now had access to colleges, universities, technical schools, and vocational programs. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. Campuses across the country were flooded with veterans eager to learn. Universities scrambled to build classrooms, hire professors, and expand facilities. Entire fields of study grew rapidly: engineering, science, medicine, business, public administration. These were not elite students pursuing abstract theory. These were practical-driven, disciplined adults who had survived a global war and were ready to build their lives. The result? A massive surge in the skilled, educated workforce that would fuel American innovation through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. The GI Bill did more than open doors for individuals. It transformed the nation's economy. Technological industries expanded. Corporate management grew. Hospitals, laboratories, and research institutions multiplied. America became not just an industrial powerhouse, but a knowledge powerhouse. A country where ordinary people could become engineers, teachers, scientists, managers, and professionals whose work shaped global progress. But education was only one pillar of the GI Bill's revolution. The second pillar was even more influential. The GI Bill made homeownership accessible to millions of families who had never imagined owning property. It offered government-backed mortgages with low interest rates and zero down payments. That meant a factory worker, a clerk, a mechanic, or a returning soldier could buy a home without needing wealth inheritance or savings. The effect was explosive. Developers across this country began building entire neighborhoods specifically designed for these new homebuyers. The most famous example was Levittown, a suburban community in New York, built using assembly line methods to keep costs low. Thousands of nearly identical homes sprang up across vast fields in a matter of months. They were small, simple, and affordable, but they represented something priceless. Stability, privacy, a place to raise children, a financial foundation for the future. For the first time in American history, homeownership became a normal expectation, not an elite privilege. This shift changed everything. It reshaped family life. It reshaped neighborhoods. It reshaped wealth. A home was not just a place to live. It was an asset, one that could grow in value, build equity, and be passed down from one generation to the next. This was the birth of generational wealth for millions of families. As suburbs expanded, so did related industries: construction, furniture, appliances, road building, retail. Highways connected new neighborhoods to city centers. Cars became essential. Shopping malls emerged as new commercial hubs. Schools expanded to meet the needs of the baby boom. The GI Bill did not just create homeowners. It created communities that defined the texture of American life for half a century. But the true genius of the GI Bill was how its benefits worked together. A veteran could go to college for free. That education could lead to a stable, well-paying job. That job could qualify them for a low-interest mortgage. That mortgage could build equity and provide economic security. And that security gave families the confidence to raise children, save money, and participate in the growing consumer economy. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Education created income. Income created homeownership. Homeownership created wealth. Wealth created opportunity. Opportunity created confidence. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate strategy to integrate returning soldiers into a booming peacetime economy and prevent another depression. But just like every chapter in American economic history, the GI Bill's benefits were not distributed equally. Black veterans often faced discrimination when applying for loans. Banks refused to lend in minority neighborhoods. Colleges denied admission on the basis of race. Local officials manipulated benefits to exclude eligible veterans. As a result, many white families built wealth through homeownership, while many black families were locked out of the same opportunities. This inequality created racial wealth gaps that remain visible today. Still, the overall impact of the GI Bill on American society was unmatched. It created the largest expansion of the middle class in world history. It elevated millions of families into stability. It strengthened the economy by turning soldiers into homeowners, professionals, and consumers. It empowered ordinary Americans to become the builders of the post-war world. By the 1950s, the results were impossible to ignore. College enrollment skyrocketed. Suburbs expanded across every state. The automobile industry boomed. Consumer spending surged. Corporate growth exploded. America became a nation of homes, cars, appliances, and opportunity. The GI Bill did not just support veterans. It redefined what was possible for the average citizen. It proved that when a nation invests in ordinary people, in their education, their housing, their ability to work and build extraordinary things happen. It proved that wealth is not something reserved for the privileged few. It can be created from the ground up. It can be built by everyday families. It can be expanded when the right structures exist. The GI Bill was the blueprint for American prosperity. It built the workforce. It built the suburbs. It built the consumer economy. It built the middle class. And it built the foundation for the next chapter in the rise of American wealth. A chapter defined by highways, suburbia, and the power of the post-war boom. By the early 1950s, America was entering one of the most dramatic transformations in its entire history, a shift so vast that it would reshape where people lived, how they worked, how they raised their families, and what it meant to be part of the American middle class. It was the rise of suburbia, A movement powered by new highways, low-cost mortgages, booming families, and a national hunger for stability after years of depression and war. Before World War II, most Americans lived in crowded cities or rural farming communities. But after the war, something new emerged. A vision of the ideal American life built around single-family homes, wide streets, quiet neighborhoods, and the promise that every family could have space, safety, and a sense of belonging. This vision became the blueprint for the modern American dream. To understand how powerful this shift was, we need to look at what suburban life represented. It represented comfort. It represented order. It represented opportunity. And above all, it represented upward mobility. But suburbia did not appear by chance. It was engineered, built through policy, economics, technology, and culture. The first ingredient was the overwhelming demand for housing. When soldiers returned home after the war, they got married in record numbers. Birth rates surged. The baby boom began. Millions of new families needed affordable homes, and they needed them fast. Cities could not keep up. Apartment buildings were crowded. Rents were rising. Urban space was limited. Developers saw an opportunity: mass-produced housing on open land outside major cities. The most iconic example was Levittown, New York. Built by the Levitt family, it used assembly line techniques borrowed from wartime manufacturing. Instead of building one house at a time, crews performed the same task on thousands of homes, moving step by step down carefully organized rows of land. Each home was modest, simple kitchens, 2 bedrooms, a small yard. But the cost was low, the mortgage was affordable, and the lifestyle was irresistible. Families who had lived in cramped city apartments could now own a home with a lawn, a driveway, and a sense of independence. Levittown became a symbol of a new American ideal, and its success triggered a nationwide boom. Throughout the 1950s, suburbs exploded across the United States. Developers built thousands of similar communities from New Jersey to California. Each one promised a version of the same dream: safety, stability, and space for a growing family. But suburbia needed more than houses to thrive. It needed mobility. It needed roads. It needed cars. Enter the second ingredient, the automobile. Before the war, cars were useful. After the war, cars became essential. A suburban lifestyle was only possible if people could drive from home to work, to stores, to schools, and back again. So Americans bought cars in staggering numbers. By the mid-1950s, car ownership was nearly universal for middle-class families. Driving shaped daily life. Drive-in theaters, drive-through restaurants, shopping centers built around parking lots, entire cities redesigned to accommodate commuters. But cars alone were not enough. America needed better roads, wider roads, faster roads, roads that connected suburbs to urban centers and to one another. This led to one of the most influential policies in American history, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. Signed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, it funded the construction of the interstate highway system, a massive network of roads that stretched across the entire nation. These highways did more than make driving convenient. They reshaped geography. They redefined opportunity. They accelerated suburban growth on a scale no one had imagined. A worker no longer needed to live near a factory or office building. They could live miles away in a quiet suburb and commute into the city. This changed where people lived, but it also changed how people saw themselves. A suburban home was a symbol of success. A car in the driveway was a sign of independence. A quiet street meant safety for children. A backyard meant a place to gather, to grill, to relax after long workdays. Suburbia was not just a location, it was an identity. Inside the suburban home, life was changing too. Modern appliances became standard. Refrigerators, stoves, washing machines, vacuum cleaners. These devices redefined household labor and created a new sense of comfort and efficiency. Televisions entered living rooms and became the center of family life. Shows portrayed happy families, neat homes, and stable communities, reinforcing the suburban ideal in millions of minds. Shopping habits changed. Supermarkets emerged as the new model for buying food. Department stores and malls became weekend destinations. Consumer culture merged with suburban culture. Owning things became part of belonging. But suburbia was not perfect. Its growth exposed deep inequalities in American society. Through discriminatory lending practices like redlining black families and other minorities, were often denied mortgages in suburban neighborhoods. Banks refused loans in communities of color. Developers imposed restrictions that excluded non-white residents. Highways were sometimes built through minority neighborhoods, displacing families and deepening segregation. These practices did not just shape where people lived, they shaped wealth. White families built equity through home ownership. Minority families were often shut out, losing access to the single most powerful engine of generational wealth in American history. Despite these injustices, the rise of suburbia remains one of the most significant economic transformations ever experienced in the United States. It created millions of jobs in construction, manufacturing, automobiles, real estate, infrastructure, and retail. It fueled consumer spending and supported the growth of new industries. It provided families with stability and a foundation to invest in education, raise children, and plan for the future. It reshaped politics as suburban voters became a powerful force in national elections. And it redefined the American dream, shifting it from survival and work to comfort and aspiration. By the mid-1960s, more Americans lived in suburbs than in cities or rural areas combined. This suburban majority would dominate American culture, economics, and identity for half a century, and its influence continues today. Suburbia was more than a housing boom. It was a statement. A belief that ordinary Americans deserved space, deserved comfort, and deserved opportunity. It turned homeownership into a symbol of stability and success. It turned families into stakeholders in the national economy, and it laid the foundation for a powerful, confident, self-sustaining middle class. In the next chapter of America's economic story, another force would rise that strengthened the middle class even further, a force built on solidarity, collective bargaining, and the belief that workers deserved a fair share of the nation's prosperity. The rise of organized labor was coming, and it would change everything. By the mid-1950s, the American middle class was rising faster than at any point in history. Homes were being built. Families were growing. Cars filled the highways. Factories produced at record levels. But behind this prosperity was a force often overlooked, a force that gave ordinary workers the wages, stability, and dignity that allowed them to build real wealth. That force was organized labor. Unions did not create the middle class alone. But without them, the middle-class boom would have been impossible. To understand why, we must go back to the decades before this transformation began. Before the 1930s, American workers had little power. Factories were dangerous. Pay was low. Hours were long. Benefits did not exist. If you were injured, you lost your job. If you were fired, you had no recourse. If you were old, there was no retirement. The rules were simple. Employers held all the power. Workers held none. The Great Depression exposed how fragile this system was. Millions lost their jobs through no fault of their own. Families were ruined. Communities collapsed. This suffering created a new movement for fairness, security, and a voice in the workplace. The turning point came with the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. This law guaranteed workers the right to organize, bargain collectively, and strike. For the first time, the federal government stood behind workers instead of standing aside. Union membership exploded. Factories, mines, railroads, construction sites, and shipyards became organized at unprecedented speed. By the late 1940s, more than one-third of the American workforce belonged to a union, a level never reached before or since. This surge in union power reshaped the American economy from the ground up. The most famous example was the United Auto Workers, the UAW, which negotiated landmark contracts with the big three automakers General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. In 1950, the UAW and GM agreed to a breakthrough deal known as the Treaty of Detroit. This contract provided workers with guaranteed annual wage increases, cost of living adjustments, employer-funded health insurance, paid vacations, and pensions for retirement. These benefits were revolutionary. They turned factory jobs into some of the most stable, well-paid, middle-class careers in the world. But the impact spread far beyond the auto industry. Other industries watched GM and followed. Steelworkers demanded the same. Miners demanded the same. Electrical workers demanded the same. Truck drivers demanded the same. This process, known as pattern bargaining, lifted wages across entire sectors of the economy. As productivity increased, wages increased. As companies grew, workers shared in the gains. This alignment, where rising productivity aligned with rising wages, became the economic engine of the post-war boom. It created a virtuous cycle. When workers earned more, they spent more. When they spent more, businesses grew. When businesses grew, they hired more workers. The middle class expanded not through charity, but through structural fairness. Unions also transformed working conditions. They pushed for safer workplaces, reasonable hours, overtime, pay grievance procedures, and job security. These protections were not luxuries. They were lifelines. They allowed workers to plan for the future without fear that a sudden illness, injury, or layoff would ruin their lives. This stability was the foundation that allowed families to buy homes, save money, and send children to college. Unions also shaped American politics. They advocated for minimum wage laws, Social Security expansion, workplace safety regulations, civil rights protections, public education funding, and unemployment insurance. The modern social safety net was built in part because unions fought for it. Labor organizations became a counterweight to corporate influence, ensuring that economic growth benefited workers as well as executives. For many families, union membership became a source of identity and pride. Entire neighborhoods were filled with men and women who worked in the same factory, earned strong wages, and lived stable lives. Unions created solidarity, a belief that prosperity should be shared and that families could rise together. But even at their peak, unions faced challenges. Women were often excluded from higher-paying positions. Black workers faced discrimination in apprenticeship programs and skilled trades. Some unions embraced inclusion and fought segregation. Others resisted change. The labor movement reflected the complexities of the era, a mixture of progress and prejudice. Still, the overall impact was extraordinary. Between 1947 and 1973, worker productivity doubled, and wages nearly doubled with it. This alignment created one of the most prosperous periods in American history. Families could live on a single income. They could buy homes in growing suburbs. They could own cars, take vacations, and build savings. This lifestyle, the classic mid-century American dream, was made possible because unions ensured that workers received a fair share of the nation's economic growth. Corporations benefited too. Stable contracts reduced labor conflict. High wages increased consumer demand. Predictable employment boosted productivity. The relationship between companies and unions was not always smooth. But during this period, both sides understood that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. Together, they created an economic environment where growth and fairness reinforced one another. This era was the golden age of the American worker, a time when the middle class was not an aspiration, but a lived reality for tens of millions of families. A time when ordinary people built extraordinary wealth through stable jobs, rising wages, and predictable benefits. A time when the United States became not just an industrial leader, but a society defined by shared prosperity. Yet the story of unions is not just about economics. It is about dignity. It is about respect. It is about giving workers the power to shape their own futures. Unions gave Americans a seat at the table, a voice in decisions that affected their lives, their families, and their communities. They helped transform the American workplace from a place of insecurity to a place of opportunity. And they helped create a middle class strong enough to define the culture, the politics, and the identity of the nation for decades. But no chapter lasts forever. As the 1970s approached, the forces that built the American dream would begin to change. Global competition, automation, oil shocks, shifting politics. These pressures would test the strength of organized labor and the stability of the middle class itself. But during its peak, the labor movement did something remarkable. It made the American dream real. It turned ordinary workers into homeowners, consumers, and wealth builders. It gave millions of families the chance to rise. And it laid the groundwork for the next force that would reshape American wealth, the rise of consumer society. When Americans today think about job stability, they imagine things that feel normal. A workplace with safety rules, a paycheck that arrives on time, a minimum wage, a weekend, basic rights that seem obvious in modern life. But none of it was obvious, and none of it existed for most workers during the first half of the 20th century. These protections had to be built policy by policy, fight by fight, often against powerful opposition. This is the story of how fairness became law in the American workplace, and how these reforms helped ordinary families accumulate wealth, gain stability, and finally enter the middle class. By the early 1930s, American workers were exhausted. They survived the brutal conditions of early industrialization. They endured the crushing shock of the Great Depression. They had watched wages fall, savings disappear, and millions of jobs vanish almost overnight. The old system had failed them, and it was clear that a new social contract was needed. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered the White House in 1933, the economy was still collapsing. Factories were closed, banks were failing, families were struggling to buy basic food. Roosevelt believed something simple but powerful. A nation could not be strong if its workers were weak. A nation could not be wealthy if its families were insecure. And a nation could not prosper if its economy worked only for the powerful. So the government began building a new system, a system designed to support ordinary Americans, a system meant to protect workers from the worst abuses of unregulated capitalism, a system that would redefine what work meant in the United States. The first major breakthrough came in 1933 with the National Industrial Recovery Act. Although short-lived, it introduced the idea that wages and working conditions were not just private matters. They were national concerns. The law encouraged industries to establish minimum wages, maximum hours, and fair competition rules. It was an early attempt to give workers dignity, but it was only the beginning. 2 years later, a true revolution arrived. In 1935, the National Labor Relations Act, often called the Wagner Act, changed American labor forever. For the first time, workers had the legal right to form unions, to bargain collectively, and to strike. Until this moment, unions were often crushed by employers. Strikers were beaten or jailed. Many were fired and blacklisted. Workers had little protection and almost no leverage. The Wagner Act shifted the balance. It created the National Labor Relations Board, a federal agency that enforced workers' rights. Employers could no longer fire someone simply for joining a union. They could no longer shut down meetings, threaten organizers, or force workers to sign away their rights. This law didn't just improve wages, it transformed the entire structure of American wealth. Here is why. Unionized jobs became steady, stable, and far better paid. Industries like steel automobiles, rubber mining, and shipping saw wages climb sharply. Benefits like paid vacations, overtime pay, and health coverage became more common. Workers who had once lived paycheck to paycheck began saving money, buying homes, sending children to school, and building generational wealth. The middle class was no longer a distant dream. It was becoming reality. But work in the 1930s was still dangerous. Thousands were injured every year in factories, mines, and mills. Child labor existed in many industries. Hours were long, often brutal, and endlessly unpredictable. That changed in 1938 with one of the most significant labor laws in American history, the Fair Labor Standards Act. This law created the modern workday. It established the first federal minimum wage. It created the 40-hour work week. It required overtime pay. and it banned oppressive child labor. These were radical shifts at the time. Many business leaders protested. They warned that factories would close. They predicted economic disaster. But the opposite happened. Families now had predictable income. They had weekends time to rest, time to spend with children, and eventually time to consume. This new balance between work and life fueled the expanding economy. People bought cars, appliances, clothes, and entertainment. Demand surged. Jobs grew. The economy did not collapse. It flourished. As the 1940s began, the United States entered World War II, and this moment pushed worker protections even further. Factories hired millions of new workers. Women entered the workforce in record numbers. Minorities gained access to jobs that had previously excluded them. Wages rose sharply, and unions gained unprecedented strength. By the time the war ended in 1945, something extraordinary had happened. Millions of Americans were earning middle-class wages for the first time in their lives. Families that had once struggled during the Depression now felt stability and hope. Savings increased. Home ownership rates climbed. New neighborhoods sprang up across the country. But rising wages were not the only change. Employer benefits transformed the financial landscape. Companies began offering paid holidays, health insurance, and retirement pensions. For the first time, workers' futures were more secure. They could retire with dignity. They could survive illness without losing everything. They could build wealth over a lifetime instead of simply surviving from one paycheck to the next. In short, the American dream became more than an idea. It became a structure, a system supported by laws, contracts, and policies that protected ordinary families. The rise of the modern middle class was not simply the result of higher wages. It was the result of stability, protection, predictability, the ability to plan for the future. These worker protections created a foundation of wealth that would expand dramatically during the post-war boom. They allowed families to buy homes, build savings, access education, and pass advantages to their children. But the impact reached even deeper. Workplace fairness reshaped American culture itself. Jobs were no longer viewed as pure survival. They became pathways to dignity. Factories became routes to opportunity. Education became a bridge to professional careers. And families began to believe that upward mobility was not just possible, but expected. Millions of immigrants, Black Americans, women, and rural families finally saw real opportunities open. Not equally, not perfectly, but more widely than ever before. The New Deal had changed the rules of American capitalism, and workers were finally seeing the benefits. Yet there is a deeper truth often overlooked. These reforms did not just help workers, they helped the entire country. A stable workforce meant a stable economy. A secure family meant stronger communities. A predictable income meant stronger consumer demand. Fairness was not charity, it was strategy. Strategy that transformed the United States into the world's strongest middle-class society. The hidden history of American wealth is not the story of a few powerful individuals. It is the story of millions of ordinary workers who fought for fairness and won. They turned factories into engines of opportunity. They turned wages into savings. They turned unions into pathways of protection. And they turned the American workplace into one of the most productive, stable, and influential economic systems in the world. This was not accidental. It was created through policy, through struggle, through courage, through a belief that workers deserved dignity and that a nation was strongest when its people were secure. The modern American middle class was built not only by industry and innovation, but by fairness becoming the law. And in the decades that followed, these protections would allow ordinary families to accumulate wealth at a scale the world had never seen. When people think about the American middle class, they often picture a simple idea: a steady job, a reliable paycheck, a sense that tomorrow will be predictable, a belief that hard work leads to security. But this image did not appear automatically. It was built through a remarkable economic shift that unfolded between the 1930s and the 1960s, a shift that lifted tens of millions of families from instability into prosperity. It was a transformation driven by something deceptively simple, yet powerful enough to reshape the nation: rising wages. For most of American history, wages were low, volatile, and unpredictable. Workers were paid whatever employers decided. There were few rules, little protection, and almost no stability. One bad month could ruin a family. One injury could destroy a future. A paycheck was not a promise. It was a gamble. But after the New Deal, after new labor laws, after unions gained real negotiating power, something extraordinary happened. For more than 3 decades, wages rose steadily across almost every major industry. And not just a little. They rose faster than at almost any other time in American history. From the late 1940s through the 1970s, worker productivity increased, and wages increased right alongside it. When factories produced more workers, earned more. When companies grew stronger, families grew stronger. The economy was expanding, and ordinary people were finally receiving their share of that expansion. This era became known as the Great American Paycheck. It was a time when the typical worker without a college degree could earn enough to support a family of 4. A single income could buy a home, a car, groceries, healthcare, a vacation once a year, and often the ability to save money for the future. For the first time, millions of Americans were no longer trapped in survival mode. They had margin, breathing room, the financial ability to think beyond next week, next month, or even next year. This stability changed the psychology of the nation. Families that once feared the future began planning it. Parents began saving for their children's education. Workers began investing in retirement plans. Young adults imagined careers, not just jobs, and communities built around factories and industries became centers of middle-class life. The impact of rising wages reached far beyond individual households. It transformed entire industries, cities, regions. It reshaped the marketplace of American life. When families had more money to spend, businesses grew. Car manufacturers thrived. Supermarkets expanded. Appliance companies flourished. Construction surged as developers built homes, schools, and roads. Consumer demand became the engine of national growth. Not the wealth of the elite, but the spending power of ordinary working families. The middle class became the driving force of the American economy. And the American economy, in return, expanded at rates unmatched by most nations in history. This cycle of rising wages and rising consumption created something unique. A country where prosperity did not flow only to the top, but across millions of households. But rising wages did more than fuel consumption. They created mobility, upward mobility. For the first time, a steel worker in Pittsburgh, a machinist in Cleveland, a dock worker in Los Angeles, or a textile worker in North Carolina could send children to college. And those children often entered professional careers, moving from working-class roots into white-collar life. Economic ladders were forming, and people were climbing them. The story of American wealth is incomplete without understanding this moment. Because this was the moment when ordinary families gained the power to build long-term prosperity. Savings accounts grew, homeownership expanded, retirement security improved, families strengthened their financial foundations. But what made rising wages possible? Why did this era succeed where others failed? The answers reveal the hidden architecture of the American middle class. The first key factor was productivity. American factories in the mid-20th century were unmatched. Industrial output soared. Technological advances flooded the workplace. Assembly lines became more efficient. Machines became faster. Processes became more precise. This meant companies could produce more goods at lower cost. And in turn, they could afford to pay workers more. The second factor was unions. Unions negotiated contracts that tied wages to productivity. When companies grew profitable, workers shared the benefits. They secured raises, overtime, pay bonuses, and better working conditions. They protected pensions and health care. They established wage floors that lifted entire sectors. The third factor was competition. During the post-war era, America had almost no economic rivals. Europe was rebuilding. Japan was rebuilding. Much of the world was recovering from war. American companies faced little foreign pressure. Factories ran at full capacity. Profits were high. And employers were willing, even eager, to pay for labor stability. The fourth factor was policy. Government investments in highways, suburbs, education, research, and infrastructure created millions of new opportunities. The GI Bill fueled college enrollment and home ownership. New Deal protections supported workers and families. Federal spending boosted the economy from every direction. With these forces combined, the American wage machine ran at full power, and families felt the results every day. A paycheck was more than income. It was identity. It was pride. It was security for children. It was respect from neighbors. It was the knowledge that tomorrow could be better. But something else was happening. Something deeper. Rising wages reshaped American culture itself. For the first time, shopping became a national ritual. Travel became attainable. Recreation became common. Baseball games, family road trips, new clothes for school, birthday gifts, holiday meals all became part of middle-class life. People were not just working to survive. They were working to live, to enjoy life, to build memories, to create the world they wanted for their children. And this cultural shift reinforced the economic one. Demand for goods increased, companies grew, jobs multiplied, wages rose further. Prosperity became self-sustaining. The great tragedy, the part often forgotten, is that this era did not benefit everyone equally. Black workers, Hispanic workers, Native American communities, many immigrants and women faced significant barriers. Discrimination in hiring, pay, housing, and education prevented millions from accessing the full benefits of the boom. Yet even so, the overall structure of rising wages pulled many forward, creating new opportunities that previous generations had never imagined. And for those who gained access to the expanding middle class, the effects were profound. A single generation could change the trajectory of a family. Children grew up in safer neighborhoods. They attended better schools. They gained access to colleges and universities. They entered professional careers. They passed financial security to their own children. This is how wealth spreads across generations. Not through sudden fortune, but through steady, reliable income that allows families to save, invest, and plan. The hidden history of American wealth is inseparable from the story of rising wages. Because wages were the tool that transformed workers into consumers, consumers into homeowners, homeowners into savers, and savers into wealth builders. This era created the conditions for upward mobility at a scale unmatched before or since. It was the moment when ordinary families became the heart of the American economy and the foundation of the American dream. The Great American Paycheck did more than change bank accounts. It changed lives. It changed identities. It changed the nation. And it remains one of the most important chapters in understanding how the United States became a global superpower built on the strength of ordinary people. When historians describe the rise of the American middle class, one factor stands above all others. Not wages, not jobs, not even education, but something far more symbolic, far more emotional, and far more financially powerful. Homeownership. A house was not just wood and concrete. It was stability. It was belonging. It was equity. It was the foundation on which millions of families built long-term wealth. But it wasn't always this way. At the start of the 20th century, owning a home was nearly impossible for ordinary Americans. Mortgages were short and expensive. Down payments were huge. Interest rates were high. Most families rented for life. Homeownership belonged to the wealthy, not the working class. That changed dramatically during the mid-20th century. And the consequences would reshape the economy, the culture, and the very structure of American life. To understand why homeownership became the engine of wealth, we must begin with a simple truth. Wealth grows fastest through assets, not wages, not consumption, but ownership. When you own something that increases in value, your future becomes more secure. Your options expand. Your chances of upward mobility multiply. And for millions of American families, the most accessible asset they could ever own was a home. The shift began during the Great Depression. Banks were collapsing. Families were losing homes at unprecedented rates. The housing market was in freefall. The government responded with policies that would unintentionally revolutionize the middle class. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was created. It introduced new mortgage standards that made loans longer cheaper and far more accessible. Instead of 3 to 5 year mortgages, loans stretched to 20 or 30 years. Instead of huge down payments, families could buy homes with a fraction of the cost. This was revolutionary. For the first time, ordinary workers could realistically buy a home. In 1944, the GI Bill expanded this opportunity dramatically. Millions of returning World War II veterans received access to low-interest home loans with no down payment at all. This single policy triggered one of the biggest housing booms in world history. Developers saw demand rising, and they responded with mass production strategies that reshaped the American landscape. The most famous example was Levittown. Rows of identical houses built quickly, efficiently, and affordably. Perfect for young families with modest incomes and big dreams. For the average worker, this was unprecedented. A home with a yard, a quiet street, a community with schools and parks. And the financial benefits were extraordinary. When a family bought one of these homes, they were not just buying shelter. They were buying an appreciating asset, a source of equity, a foundation for generational wealth. In the post-war decades, housing prices rose steadily. Mortgages were stable. Interest rates were manageable. Neighborhoods developed strong public services from schools to infrastructure. Every mortgage payment built equity. Every year of appreciation increased wealth. Every improvement, new paint, better windows, a remodeled kitchen boosted the value of the home. Savings accounts grew slowly. Stocks were still intimidating. But home equity grew almost automatically. This is how wealth was built. Quietly, steadily, over decades. For millions of families, homeownership turned economic fragility into economic stability. But the impact went far beyond money. Owning a home shaped community life. Families put down roots. Neighbors built relationships. Schools improved because homeowners demanded better education. Local governments strengthened because property taxes funded public services. A stable home created a stable childhood. Stable childhoods produced better educational outcomes. Better educational outcomes produced better jobs, and better jobs produced more wealth. The benefits multiplied across generations. A child raised in a middle-class home was far more likely to enter the middle class as an adult. This was not coincidence. It was the structure of homeownership at work. But the story of American homeownership is incomplete without acknowledging its inequalities. For decades, federal policies favored white families and excluded many Black, Hispanic, Asian, and Native American families from buying homes in booming suburban areas. Redlining, discriminatory lending, and restrictive covenants prevented minority communities from accessing the same opportunities. As white families built equity in rising property markets, many minority families were locked out. The wealth gap widened, not because of ability, not because of effort, but because of access. This inequity remains one of the most enduring legacies of 20th century housing policy. Yet even with unequal access, the overall impact of homeownership on the middle class was profound. By the 1960s, more than 60% of American families owned their homes. This was one of the highest rates in the world. And this ownership rate became a defining feature of American identity. Home ownership meant dignity. It meant stability. It meant independence. A home became a symbol of success and the centerpiece of the American dream. The architecture of suburbs reflected this new cultural ideal. Cul-de-sacs, two-car garages, lawns trimmed neatly, local schools, playgrounds, community groups, barbecue gatherings. Suburbia became the physical shape of the expanding middle class. But beneath the culture and symbolism, the financial engine kept running. Home values continued rising through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. The equity created by rising home prices allowed families to pay for college, start small businesses, or save for retirement. This is how an ordinary factory worker could one day afford to send children to become doctors, engineers, teachers, or managers. Homeownership turned wages into wealth, and wealth into opportunity. But perhaps the most important part of this story is how unintentional it all was. Policymakers did not set out to create the biggest middle-class wealth engine in history. They were trying to solve the immediate problems of the Depression and the challenges of reintegrating millions of veterans after World War II. Yet those policies, combined with mass production and a booming post-war economy, triggered a transformation no one fully predicted. Housing wealth became the largest source of middle-class net worth for decades. Even today, for the majority of American families, the home remains the biggest financial asset they own. But the golden age of homeownership was not permanent. By the late 20th century, housing markets began to shift. Affordability declined, speculation increased, debt rose, and inequality in homeownership became more visible. Still, the legacy remains. The story of how ordinary families built American wealth cannot be told without homeownership. It was the engine that turned modest incomes into stable futures. It was the bridge that connected generations. It was the structure that allowed millions to rise into the middle class. A house was never just a house. It was the foundation on which the American dream was built. And in the next chapter of this documentary, we will explore how education, another powerful force, reinforced this rise and helped ordinary families push the boundaries of opportunity even further. When Americans think about opportunity, they often think about education. Classrooms, books, teachers who inspire, degrees that open doors, the promise that learning can change a life. But this idea is surprisingly modern. At the start of the 20th century, education in the United States was limited, inconsistent, and often inaccessible to ordinary families. High school was not universal. College was a luxury. Many children worked instead of studied. And for millions of families, education was something distant, something they hoped for but rarely reached. Yet by the late 20th century, education had become one of the most powerful engines driving the American middle class. It shaped opportunities. It reshaped identities. It transformed the workforce. And it created a pathway for millions of ordinary people to rise far beyond the circumstances they were born into. The story of how this transformation happened is one of the most important chapters in the hidden history of American wealth. To understand it, we must begin with a simple fact. Education expands potential. It increases earning power. It strengthens communities. And it multiplies opportunities not just for one generation, but for every generation that follows. But none of this was guaranteed. It had to be built. Slowly. deliberately, and sometimes through crisis. The first major shift came with the rise of public high schools. Before 1900, only a small minority of American teenagers attended high school. Most went straight to work in factories, farms, or family businesses. But as the economy industrialized, new jobs required reading, writing, math, and technical skill. Factories became more complex. Offices expanded. Railroads, utilities, and steel plants needed workers who could manage machinery, track inventory, and understand basic engineering. Communities realized that education was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Between 1910 and 1940, high school enrollment skyrocketed. Cities built new schools, curriculums expanded, teachers were trained more rigorously. This was the high school movement, one of the most important yet least discussed educational revolutions in modern history. It created the first generation of broadly educated American workers, and it prepared the country for the economic explosion that would follow. But the true turning point arrived after World War II. When millions of veterans returned home, the United States faced a pressing challenge. How could the nation reintegrate so many soldiers without throwing the economy into chaos? The GI Bill provided the solution. It offered tuition assistance so veterans could attend college technical schools or vocational programs at little or no cost. This was unprecedented. College had been reserved for the wealthy, the elite, and the academically privileged. Now, for the first time, ordinary Americans could access higher education on a massive scale. Within a few years, college campuses overflowed with students. Lecture halls were filled with veterans eager to learn engineering, medicine, law, business, and science. Universities expanded rapidly. New buildings rose across the country. Entire fields of study grew. This education boom did more than uplift individuals. It reshaped the workforce. It created millions of skilled professionals. It fueled innovation. It gave companies access to far more talent than ever before, and it built the intellectual backbone of the American superpower. The impact was generational. Children of educated parents entered households with more books, more stability, and more ambition. They grew up believing that education was normal, expected, and essential. The middle-class identity became intertwined with schooling. Parents told their children to study hard, get good grades, go to college, and build a better life. But education did more than expand opportunity. It equalized opportunity. At least that was the goal. Public schools created a baseline where children from different backgrounds could sit in the same classrooms, learn the same subjects, and pursue the same dreams. Community colleges expanded this mission further, affordable nearby and open to everyone. By the 1960s and 1970s, the United States had built one of the most accessible education systems in the world, and the results were astonishing. Better education created better jobs. Better jobs created higher wages. Higher wages created savings and stability. And stability allowed families to invest in their children's futures. It was a cycle of growth that strengthened the entire middle class. Education became the ladder that millions used to climb out of poverty. But like every part of the American story, this ladder was not available to everyone equally. Segregation, underfunded school districts, racial discrimination, and geographic inequality created vast differences in educational quality. Black Americans, Hispanic families, Native communities, and many immigrants faced barriers that made it harder to access the opportunities education offered. Brown v. Board of Education, passed in 1954, declared segregated schools unconstitutional. But real integration would take decades. Even so, the overall expansion of education remains one of the most successful and transformative policies in American history. It created the modern white-collar workforce. It allowed millions of families to enter new industries, from healthcare to engineering to finance to technology. By the 1980s, education had become the most important predictor of lifetime earnings, career success, and financial stability. A college degree dramatically increased income. But even high school offered far better opportunities than the world before 1900. Education also shaped culture. It encouraged debate. It strengthened democracy. It exposed students to new ideas. It nurtured innovation, creativity, and scientific discovery. Universities became centers where new technologies were born. Computers, telecommunications, medical breakthroughs, engineering advancements. The research funded in classrooms and labs became the foundation of entire industries. Silicon Valley itself was built on the intellectual output of American universities and the GI Bill generation that filled their classrooms. Education didn't just benefit individuals, it powered the economy, it built the middle class, and it strengthened the nation. But the most important impact was generational. When a child grows up in a home with educated parents, they inherit more than knowledge. They inherit confidence, expectation, belief. They inherit the idea that success is possible. Education expanded that belief to millions. Families who once struggled to read or write raised children who became engineers, nurses, teachers, scientists, and business owners. This upward mobility created a ripple effect across the entire country. Cities grew more prosperous. Communities became more stable. Innovation flourished. Education became the great equalizer, not because it solved every inequity, but because it unlocked the potential of ordinary people. And that potential became the fuel that transformed the United States into the most powerful economy of the 20th century. The hidden history of American wealth cannot be explained without education. It was the lever that lifted millions, the tool that opened doors, the foundation on which modern opportunity was built. In the next chapter, we will explore how consumer culture, born from rising wages, rising education, and rising home ownership, became the force that shaped American identity and turned the middle class into the economic engine of the world. When people around the world picture the American middle class, they often imagine something simple: a home filled with modern appliances, a driveway with a family car, a refrigerator stocked with food, a living room centered around a television, and the freedom to buy the things that make life comfortable. But behind this familiar image lies one of the most powerful economic forces of the 20th century, the consumer revolution. It was not created by corporations alone. It was not driven by elites. It was built by millions of ordinary families who finally had disposable income, free time, and access to the modern conveniences that reshaped daily life. Their spending didn't just improve their own lives. It powered the entire American economy. It fueled innovation. It created industries. It supported millions of jobs. It turned the middle class into the beating heart of national growth. To understand this transformation, we must go back to the years after World War II. The United States emerged from the war as the world's industrial leader. Factories were running at full capacity. Workers were earning record wages. Families had money saved from years of rationing, and there was a hunger for normal life, a hunger for comfort, predictability, and the small pleasures that had been delayed during the Depression and the war. This hunger became the fuel for a cultural and economic explosion. The first major change was in the home itself. During the 1930s, many families lacked basic appliances. Refrigerators, washing machines, and vacuum cleaners were luxuries. But by the 1950s and 1960s, these products became affordable for millions of households. Refrigerators preserved food longer. Electric stoves saved hours of work. Washing machines replaced entire days of manual labor. Vacuum cleaners made cleaning faster and easier. These innovations didn't just modernize the home. They freed up time. Time that families could use for education, hobbies, leisure, or part-time work. This newfound free time became a cornerstone of middle-class culture. It allowed families to watch television together. It allowed parents to attend school events. It allowed children to participate in sports. It allowed communities to grow stronger. A home filled with modern appliances was not a symbol of luxury. It was a symbol of stability. The second major driver of the consumer revolution was mobility. Cars had existed for decades, but after World War II, they became essential to everyday life. Suburbs were spreading quickly. and public transportation could not keep up. So the family car became the link between homework, school, shopping, and entertainment. By the late 1950s, two-car households were becoming common. Cars provided independence, privacy, and access to a wider world. They made road trips possible. They connected families to relatives living far away. They allowed children to attend better schools in neighboring towns. The automobile industry grew into one of the largest employers in the country. Steel, rubber, glass, textiles, mechanics, dealerships, highway construction. All of it expanded because ordinary families wanted mobility. The third major force was entertainment. Television became the most influential device in the American household. It brought news stories and shared culture into living rooms across the country. Families watched the same shows at the same time, creating a national conversation. TV also became the most powerful advertising platform ever invented. Commercials didn't just sell products. They sold ideas, aspirations, imagery. The message was clear. Modern life was available. Comfort was attainable. And the middle class was the center of American identity. Television also shaped politics, fashion, music, and social trends. It taught families what was new, what was desirable, and what was possible. Advertising soon expanded into magazines, billboards, radio, newspapers, and eventually early computers. This advertising boom helped accelerate the consumer revolution by linking products to emotions and social status. Buying a new appliance was no longer just practical. It meant progress. Buying a new car was not just transportation. It meant success. Buying the latest clothing was not just fashion. It meant identity. Consumption became a cultural language. The fourth major driver was credit. Before the mid-20th century, families paid cash for most purchases. Large purchases required years of saving. But as wages rose and consumer goods multiplied, a new financial tool emerged. Credit cards. The first major card, Bank Americard, later known as Visa, spread rapidly in the 1950s and 1960s. Then came MasterCharge, later MasterCard. Credit allowed families to purchase goods immediately and pay over time. This increased economic flexibility. It helped families manage emergencies. It smoothed out income fluctuations. And it fueled higher levels of consumer demand. But it also created a new kind of risk: debt. Families now had to manage budgets carefully. Some succeeded, some struggled. But overall, credit helped amplify the purchasing power of the middle class and accelerated economic growth. The fifth major driver was shopping culture itself. Malls appeared across the country, climate-controlled, filled with stores, restaurants, music, social energy. Malls became the new town square, a place where teenagers gathered, where families spent weekends, where parents shopped for holidays and back-to-school seasons. The rise of supermarkets reshaped food culture. Endless aisles, one-stop convenience, lower prices. Fast food chains like McDonald's, Burger King, and later Pizza Hut and Wendy's became staples of family life. Convenience became a defining value. All of these consumer shifts created a self-reinforcing cycle. Workers spent money. Companies grew. Jobs expanded. Wages increased. Families gained stability. Stability fueled confidence. Confidence fueled spending. And spending fueled the world's strongest economy. But the consumer revolution was not just about buying things. It reshaped the American identity. It made middle-class life something visible, something shared, something that people recognized instantly. It created rituals like Christmas gift shopping, back-to-school clothing trips, summer road trips, movie nights, mall outings. It created symbols like the family car, the backyard grill, and the color television. These images spread around the world through films, TV, and music. The American dream became not only a national ideal, but a global aspiration. But the consumer revolution also had consequences. Waste increased, debt grew, environmental impacts widened, and over time, the ability to maintain a consumer-driven lifestyle became more difficult for families facing rising costs and stagnant wages. Still, its legacy is undeniable. The rise of the American middle class was not built on luxury. It was built on access. Access to goods, access to comfort, access to options that previous generations could only dream of. The consumer revolution gave identity to the middle class. It gave power to the middle class. And it gave the American economy the unstoppable engine that carried it through the second half of the 20th century. In the next chapter, we explore a turning point. The moment when the middle class, once rising confidently, began facing new pressures from inflation, global competition, and technological change. A moment that would reveal how fragile prosperity could be and how quickly the foundation of the middle class could shift beneath their feet. By the early 1970s, the American middle class had reached a peak of prosperity that seemed almost unshakable. Wages were strong, jobs were stable, factories were running at full capacity. Suburbs were full of families living lives that earlier generations could barely imagine. But beneath this surface of confidence were forces gathering strength, forces that would change the economy in ways no one could fully predict. The decades that followed would test the foundation of American wealth and reveal how fragile prosperity could be when confronted with global competition, rising prices, technological change, and shifting corporate priorities. This is the story of how the middle class entered a new era, an era defined not by growth, but by pressure. For nearly 30 years after World War II, productivity and wages rose together. When workers became more productive, they earned more. Companies shared profits. Communities thrived. But by the mid-1970s, that historic relationship began to break. For the first time, productivity continued to rise while wages began to flatten. Workers were producing more but earning less. The reasons were complex, but they were deeply interconnected. The first major force was global competition. After World War II, the United States stood almost alone as the world's industrial leader. Europe and Japan were rebuilding from devastation. Most developing countries lacked advanced manufacturing. For decades, American companies faced little foreign competition. But by the 1970s, that era had ended. Germany and Japan rebuilt with modern factories, advanced engineering, and highly trained workforces. Japanese car makers gained a reputation for efficiency and quality. German companies excelled in precision tools, automobiles, and industrial equipment. American companies, weighed down by older factories and slower innovation, struggled to compete. Imports rose dramatically. American products faced pressure. Factories lost market share. And the workers who had built the industrial middle class were starting to feel the ground shifting beneath them. The second major force was inflation. In the early 1970s, the United States faced a series of shocks. Oil prices skyrocketed after geopolitical conflict in the Middle East. Energy shortages led to gas lines stretching for blocks. Prices rose faster than wages could keep up. For the first time in decades, families who had felt confident began struggling to afford basic necessities. Groceries cost more. Utilities cost more. Transportation cost more. The stability that had defined post-war America was starting to crack. The third force was technological change. Automation, once a slow process, accelerated rapidly. Factories introduced new machinery that required fewer workers. Computers entered offices, reducing the need for entire categories of clerical jobs. The shift was subtle at first. A single machine replacing 2 or 3 workers. But over time, entire departments were redesigned around automation. Companies embraced these efficiencies to stay competitive globally. But for many workers, the message was clear. Job security, once taken for granted, was no longer guaranteed. The fourth challenge came from within corporations themselves. During the mid-20th century, companies viewed employees as long-term investments. Executives earned modestly compared to workers. Pensions were generous. Career paths were clear. But by the 1970s and 1980s, corporate philosophy shifted. Shareholders, not workers, became the top priority. Profit maximization replaced community investment. Short-term gains replaced long-term stability. Executive compensation soared. Pensions began disappearing. Benefits shrank. Jobs moved to states with cheaper labor. then to countries with even cheaper labor. The changes were dramatic, but they unfolded slowly enough that many families didn't fully realize how different the economy had become until the effects reached their doorstep. The fifth major force was the decline of unions. For decades, unions had been the backbone of the middle class. They negotiated higher wages, benefits, and safer conditions. They gave workers power in industries dominated by giant corporations. But starting in the 1970s, union membership began to fall. Some declines happened because industries shifted overseas. Some because companies fought aggressively to prevent union organizing. Some because laws changed to restrict union activity. Without unions, workers lost bargaining power. Wages stagnated. Benefits eroded. And the economic security that had defined middle-class life began to fade. The sixth force was inequality. For decades, income growth was broadly shared. The gap between rich and poor was narrower than in most other industrialized countries. But by the late 1970s, income inequality began to widen. Top earners captured more wealth. Stockholders benefited from rising markets. But workers whose wages stagnated did not share equally in the gains. The result was a growing divide. A divide in income. A divide in opportunity. A divide in expectations for the future. All of these forces reached families directly. For the first time, one salary was no longer enough for many middle-class households. Mothers entered the workforce not simply because they wanted to, but because they had to. Families worked longer hours just to maintain the same standard of living their parents had achieved with a single income. Debt became a tool to fill the gap. Credit cards, auto loans, student loans, mortgages with adjustable rates. These financial tools helped families stay afloat. But they also created new vulnerabilities that earlier generations never had to face. The middle class had not vanished, but it was under pressure from every direction. Yet even in this challenging landscape, there was another side to the story. Innovation continued. New industries emerged. Technology reshaped the economy. Finance expanded. Healthcare grew. Education became even more important. Some families found incredible opportunities. Others struggled as old pathways to stability slowly disappeared. The middle class was not lost, but it was changing. Its strength was no longer guaranteed by unions, manufacturing jobs, or lifelong employment. It now depended on education, adaptability, and navigating an economy that was becoming more global, more competitive, and more uncertain. The great question that began in the 1970s still echoes today. How does a nation built on broad prosperity maintain a middle class when the forces shaping the economy are global and constantly shifting? In the next chapter, we explore the transformations of the 1980s and 1990s, when new technologies, new industries, and new policies reshaped the American economy once again and set the stage for the digital age that would redefine wealth for an entire generation. By the early 1980s, America was standing at the beginning of a transformation as profound as the Industrial Revolution itself. The economy was shifting. Technology was accelerating. Globalization was intensifying. And the very definition of middle-class opportunity was about to change forever. If the mid-20th century was powered by factories, unions, and mass production, the late 20th century would be powered by silicon software and information. It was the dawn of a digital era, one that would create enormous wealth, new industries, and new ways of working. But it would also create divides between those who adapted and those who were left behind. This is the story of how the 1980s and 1990s rewired the American economy and reshaped what it meant to build a middle-class life in a changing world. The first major shift was technological. Computers had existed for decades, but they were massive, expensive, and limited to government agencies, large corporations, and research institutions. Then came the microchip. Small, powerful, affordable. It revolutionized everything. By the early 1980s, computers were shrinking from room-sized machines to desktop devices that families could place in their homes and offices. Companies like IBM and later Apple brought computing to the mainstream. Software companies emerged to solve problems that people had only just realized needed solving. Spreadsheets replaced handwritten ledgers. Word processors replaced typewriters. Email replaced paper memos. Entire layers of clerical work were automated. Businesses became more efficient, but this efficiency came with consequences. Jobs disappeared. Workers without digital skills found themselves pushed to the margins. The computer revolution created opportunity, but demanded adaptation. The second major shift was economic. During the 1980s, deregulation and tax reforms reshaped the financial landscape. Wall Street expanded rapidly. Investment banks grew powerful. New financial instruments reshaped global markets. The culture of corporate America shifted toward shareholder value above all else. This created incentives for companies to cut costs, move production overseas, and automate aggressively. For some workers, especially those in technology, finance, and professional services, this was a time of rapid upward mobility. For others, especially in manufacturing, it was a time of loss. Factories closed. Industries relocated. Entire towns were hollowed out. The middle class was splitting into those who prospered in the new knowledge economy and those who struggled to find a foothold in it. The third major shift was globalization. Transportation costs fell. Communication accelerated. Supply chains expanded across continents. Companies no longer needed to produce goods in the United States. They could manufacture abroad for a fraction of the cost. This lowered prices for consumers but also eliminated millions of stable, well-paid jobs that had once anchored the middle class. Communities built around steel, auto manufacturing, textiles, and electronics were hit hardest. Global competition was not just competition between companies. It became competition between workers around the world. The era of guaranteed employment was ending. The fourth major force was cultural. As the economy shifted toward information and innovation, college degrees became more valuable than ever. Higher education, once a competitive advantage, became a requirement for access to the new economy. Families felt this pressure intensely. Parents urged their children to attend college even as tuition costs climbed. Student loans expanded to meet demand. This created new opportunities for millions, but also introduced a new kind of debt that previous generations had never known. Education, once a ladder to prosperity, was becoming a financial burden even as it remained essential. The fifth major shift was the birth of the internet. In the early 1990s, most Americans had never heard of the World Wide Web. By the late 1990s, it was everywhere. Dial-up modems buzzed and screeched in living rooms across the country. Early websites gave people access to information faster than any library. Email connected families across the nation. Online shopping, once unimaginable, became normal. The internet created a new generation of companies that would reshape global commerce forever. Amazon, Google, eBay. These companies redefined how Americans worked, shopped, communicated, and learned. New millionaires were created overnight. Stock markets surged. The digital economy was born, but once again the benefits were uneven. Workers with technical skills thrived. Workers without them found themselves excluded from the highest-paying jobs of the new era. This created a technological divide that would shape inequality for decades. The sixth major shift was family structure. Dual-income households became the norm, not because families wanted luxury, but because they needed two incomes to maintain the lifestyle that one income had supported in the 1950s. Work hours increased, commutes lengthened, childcare costs rose. The middle class was working harder just to stay in place. Yet even with these pressures, the 1980s and 1990s were also decades of enormous possibility. Millions entered new careers in technology, healthcare, education, and business services. Women joined the workforce at unprecedented rates, reshaping family life and expanding economic opportunity. Entrepreneurship flourished as starting a business became more accessible. Homeownership remained strong. Retirement accounts grew through 401k plans and stock market investments. And for many families, the wealth accumulated during these years became the foundation of financial stability for the next generation. The digital revolution was not simply a technological shift. It was an economic reset, a cultural reset, a generational reset. It changed how Americans worked, what they earned, where they lived, and what they aspired to achieve. It created opportunity, but demanded adaptation. It expanded wealth, but also magnified inequality. It lifted millions while leaving others behind. The middle class had entered a new era, one defined not by guaranteed stability, but by the need to constantly evolve. This new world rewarded education, flexibility, and innovation, and it set the stage for the 21st century, a century where technology would permeate every part of life, and where the definition of wealth would expand beyond anything the 20th century had imagined. In the next chapter, we explore how the early 2000s, the digital boom, and the financial crises reshaped the middle class once again, and revealed just how fragile modern wealth had become in an interconnected world. When the new millennium began, America entered the 21st century with extraordinary confidence. The internet was booming. The stock market was soaring. New technologies were appearing every year, reshaping communication, entertainment, and business. For many families, it felt like the beginning of a new golden age. But beneath the optimism were vulnerabilities that would soon erupt into some of the most significant economic shocks the modern middle class had ever faced. The early 2000s would bring a decade defined by rapid technological change, global interconnection, historic financial crises, and a growing sense that the stability once taken for granted was slipping out of reach. This is the story of how the 2000s reshaped wealth in ways that still shape American life today. The first turning point came in the year 2000 with the bursting of the dot-com bubble. For years, investors had poured billions into internet companies with little more than a website, a big idea, and a promise of future profits. New startups appeared every day. Stock prices skyrocketed. Ordinary Americans invested heavily, believing the internet was a guaranteed path to wealth. But by March 2000, the bubble burst. Hundreds of companies collapsed. Trillions of dollars in stock market value vanished almost overnight. Retirement accounts shrank. Savings evaporated. Many families experienced their first taste of how fragile digital wealth could be. But the economy did not collapse entirely. The fundamentals were strong enough to keep the country moving. And within a few years, a new wave of innovation emerged. Search engines improved. Online shopping expanded. Mobile phones became essential. The seeds of the tech giants that would dominate the next 2 decades were already growing. Yet even as technology advanced, another storm was forming. The second turning point came on September 11, 2001. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon did more than create national trauma. They triggered economic aftershocks that rippled through industries for years. Airlines collapsed. Tourism plunged. Insurance markets were shaken. Entire sectors dependent on travel trade and global movement were forced to reinvent themselves. The federal government responded with massive spending on national security and military operations. This created jobs and stabilized parts of the economy, but it also expanded debt and reshaped government priorities for decades to come. For middle-class families, the impact of 9/11 was both emotional and economic. It created uncertainty. It reshaped job markets. It redirected resources away from domestic programs that once supported economic mobility. But the most significant shift of the decade was still ahead. The third turning point was the rise of the housing bubble. For generations, home ownership had been the cornerstone of middle-class wealth. It offered stability, equity, and the promise of long-term financial security. But in the early 2000s, housing changed from a tool for stability into a source of speculation. Banks and lenders offered mortgages to millions of families who previously could not qualify. Interest-only loans, adjustable-rate mortgages, and subprime products exploded in popularity. Families were told they could afford more house than ever before. Investors bought properties as quickly as possible, believing prices would rise forever. Construction boomed. Real estate became a cultural obsession. But underneath the excitement was a fragile foundation. Millions of loans were built on risk. Millions more were packaged into financial products that almost no one fully understood. When interest rates rose and homeowners began struggling to make payments, the system started to crack. By 2007, the cracks became fractures, and in 2008, the entire system collapsed. The fourth turning point was the Great Recession. It was the most significant economic crisis since the Great Depression. Banks failed. Housing prices plunged. Trillions in wealth disappeared. Foreclosures swept across neighborhoods. Families lost homes they had spent years building. Unemployment surged. Industries collapsed. The middle class, already under pressure from globalization and technological change, now faced a financial disaster that erased decades of progress. Retirement savings shrank. Job security vanished. Debt increased as families struggled to stay afloat. The crisis exposed vulnerabilities that had been growing for years. It showed how deeply connected the global economy had become. A problem in American mortgages could ripple across Europe, Asia, and beyond. It also showed how unequal the economy had become. While millions lost jobs and homes, the financial institutions responsible for much of the crisis were rescued through massive government intervention. Recovery was slow, uneven, and deeply painful. But even in the shadow of the Great Recession, new realities were forming that would reshape the next generation. The fifth major shift was the explosion of digital technology and mobile computing. The iPhone, introduced in 2007, changed everything. Suddenly, the internet fit in your pocket. Apps created new industries. Social media reshaped communication. Digital platforms transformed shopping, transportation, and entertainment. Companies like Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google became central to daily life. Entire categories of jobs appeared overnight in coding, design, data logistics, e-commerce, and digital marketing. But technology also replaced millions of traditional jobs in retail, printing, manufacturing, and administrative work. The digital economy rewarded skills that many workers did not yet have, and it widened the gap between high earners and everyone else. The sixth shift was cultural and financial. Families became more reliant on credit than ever before. Credit cards, student loans, auto loans, medical debt. These financial tools helped families survive, but also created long-term burdens that limited mobility. In the decades before wealth was built through stable jobs, pensions, and affordable homes, in the 2000s, wealth depended increasingly on navigating a complex financial system that rewarded knowledge and punished uncertainty. Through all of this, the middle class did not disappear, but it changed. It became more fragile, more financially stretched, more dependent on education and specialized skills. It lived in a world where opportunity still existed, but stability was no longer guaranteed. Yet even as crises reshaped the landscape, the resilience of American families remained visible. Communities rebuilt, workers retrained, new industries emerged. The 2000s were a decade of disruption, adaptation, and profound transformation. They revealed the strengths and weaknesses of the modern American economy, and they prepared the way for the challenges and innovations of the 21st century, from automation and artificial intelligence to new forms of work and new ideas about what economic security should mean. In the next chapter, we explore how the 2010s, the rise of the gig economy, and new patterns of wealth reshaped the middle class once again and forced the nation to rethink the meaning of stability in an age defined by constant change. When the 2010s began, America was still emerging from the shadow of the Great Recession. Millions of families were rebuilding their finances. Millions more were trying to re-enter the workforce. The housing market was slowly recovering. The job market was shifting. Confidence was cautious. But underneath this slow recovery was a transformation that would redefine how Americans worked, earned, and built wealth. For the middle class, the 2010s were not just a decade of economic change. They were a decade of reinvention. The first major shift was the rise of the gig economy. Companies like Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, Instacart, DoorDash, and Fiverr offered flexible work to millions of people. Anyone with a car, a smartphone, or a skill could earn money whenever they needed to. For some, this flexibility was liberating. Stay-at-home parents could work between responsibilities. Students could earn money between classes. Retired workers could supplement fixed incomes. But for many others, gig work reflected something deeper. A decline in stable jobs, a decline in predictable wages, a decline in benefits that earlier generations took for granted. Gig workers were classified as independent contractors. No health insurance, no retirement benefits, no job protections. They carried the risks that employers once carried. It was work without a safety net. The second major shift was the transformation of full-time employment itself. Even traditional jobs became less secure. Companies adopted just-in-time scheduling to reduce labor costs. Contract positions expanded across industries. Career paths became unpredictable. The idea of a lifelong job faded into history. Workers now needed constant training, new certifications, and continuous adaptation to stay competitive. This created anxiety, but it also created opportunity. People learned new skills online. Boot camps taught coding. Workshops taught design. YouTube became the world's largest classroom. Education was no longer limited to universities. It became on-demand digital and accessible to anyone willing to learn. The third major shift was the rise of automation and artificial intelligence. Robots took over warehouse work. Software automated accounting data entry and customer service. AI replaced tasks that once required human judgment. This didn't eliminate all jobs, but it did change which jobs were growing and which jobs were shrinking. High-skill, high-tech roles expanded. Low-skill routine jobs declined. The job market was becoming polarized. Workers at the top thrived. Workers at the bottom struggled. Workers in the middle felt squeezed from both directions. The fourth major shift was the changing nature of wealth. For most of the 20th century, wealth came from wages, pensions, and home ownership. But in the 2010s, wealth increasingly came from assets. Stocks, real estate, businesses, intellectual property. Those who owned assets grew wealthier as markets surged. Those who relied only on wages fell behind. This divide reshaped the middle class. A family with a modest home and retirement investments could grow stable wealth. A family without assets struggled to keep up with rising costs for housing, healthcare, and education. Owning things had become more powerful than earning things. The fifth major shift was the explosion of digital platforms. Amazon reshaped retail. Airbnb reshaped travel. Netflix reshaped entertainment. Facebook reshaped communication. YouTube reshaped culture. These platforms created billion-dollar industries and millions of jobs. But they also disrupted traditional businesses. Retail stores closed across the country. Shopping malls emptied. Newspapers collapsed. Cable TV declined. Entire industries were forced to reinvent themselves. Digital convenience was creating new opportunities while destroying old ones. The sixth major shift was demographic. Millennials became the largest generation in the workforce. They entered adulthood during two major recessions. Their wages lagged behind previous generations. Housing was more expensive. Tuition was higher. Healthcare costs had risen dramatically. Millennials delayed marriage, delayed children, and delayed purchasing homes. Their economic reality was not shaped by abundance, but by instability. Yet they adapted. They built online businesses. They learned new skills. They embraced remote work. They created new cultures of entrepreneurship and creativity. The seventh major shift was housing. As cities grew more popular, housing costs skyrocketed. In places like San Francisco, New York, Seattle, and Los Angeles, homeownership became almost impossible for middle-class families. Rent consumed more and more income. Suburbs expanded further outward. Commutes grew longer. Affordable housing became one of the biggest challenges facing working families. The eighth major shift was healthcare. Medical costs rose faster than wages. Insurance became more complicated, more expensive, and less predictable. Families lived one medical emergency away from financial crisis. Healthcare, once a stabilizing force, had become a source of anxiety. Yet despite all these pressures, the 2010s were also a decade of innovation and resilience. Millions of small businesses launched online. Millions of entrepreneurs built careers from laptops and smartphones. Remote work became normalized. Digital tools empowered people to create, teach, learn, and earn in ways the 20th century never imagined. The middle class was evolving again, not disappearing but changing shape. It was becoming more digital, more flexible, more entrepreneurial, and more dependent on navigating complex systems of technology, finance, and global markets. The decade also revealed a deeper truth. The middle class was no longer defined solely by income. It was defined by stability, by access to healthcare, housing, education, and opportunity, by the ability to adapt to a world that changed every single year. The story of the 2010s is not a story of decline. It is a story of transition. a transition from old models of steady employment to new models of flexible work, a transition from physical industries to digital ones, a transition from local economies to global networks. And through all of it, the middle class survived because families adapted, innovated, and found new ways to move forward. In the next chapter, we explore the final piece of this story, how the 2020s, a decade defined by global crisis, remote work, and rapid technological acceleration, reshaped the middle class once again and forced America to confront the future of work wealth and the American dream itself. When the 2020s began, America did not ease into a new decade. It was thrust into one of the most disruptive periods of modern history. A global pandemic brought the economy to a sudden halt. Offices emptied, airports quieted, schools closed. Millions of workers shifted overnight into remote work. Millions more lost jobs as entire industries collapsed. For the middle class, the decade began with shock, fear, and profound uncertainty. Yet within this disruption lay the seeds of the next transformation of American life. The first major shift was the rise of remote work. Before 2020, working from home was a privilege reserved for a minority of knowledge workers. After 2020, it became mainstream. Companies realized that work did not always require physical offices. Employees realized that productivity did not depend on commutes, cubicles, or corporate buildings. Families discovered a new rhythm. Parents worked while supervising children. Workers saved money on transportation. Millions moved to cheaper cities or rural towns. The geography of the middle class began to shift for the first time since the suburban boom of the 1950s. Remote work reshaped housing markets. Homes with extra rooms or home offices surged in demand. Cities like Austin, Nashville, Boise, Tampa, and Denver grew rapidly as families relocated for affordability. Meanwhile, downtown business districts lost foot traffic. Restaurants closed, office towers emptied. Entire urban economies were forced to reinvent themselves. The second major shift was digital acceleration. Everything moved online. Shopping, education, entertainment, healthcare, banking, social interaction. The pandemic compressed a decade of change into a single year. Grocery delivery became normal. Telemedicine became mainstream. Online learning became the default. Streaming replaced theaters. Video conferences replaced conference rooms. Digital tools became the backbone of modern life. This shift expanded opportunities for some, but exposed new vulnerabilities for others. Workers with digital skills thrived. Workers in hospitality, service industries, and hands-on trades faced layoffs, reduced hours, or forced career changes. Inequality widened. The third shift was economic turbulence. Supply chains broke down. Factories closed due to lockdowns. Shipping delays caused shortages of cars, electronics materials, and basic goods. Prices rose. Inflation surged to levels not seen in decades. Housing costs skyrocketed as demand outpaced supply. Childcare costs increased as centers struggled to stay open. Gasoline prices jumped. For the middle class, everyday costs began to erode the stability they had fought for through the previous decade. The fourth shift was a generational awakening. Younger Americans entered adulthood during a period of crisis and reinvention. They challenged traditional ideas about work, wealth, and identity. Many rejected the idea of a single lifelong career. They pursued multiple income streams, side businesses, and creative ventures. Others questioned the value of expensive degrees when online learning offered alternatives. Some refused to return to low-wage jobs with unpredictable schedules and limited benefits. The Great Resignation became a defining moment of the early 2020s. Workers quit in record numbers, demanding higher pay, better conditions, and more control over their lives. It was a turning point in the balance between labor and corporate power. The fifth shift was the expansion of automation and artificial intelligence. Self-checkout stations reduced cashier jobs. Robotics transformed warehouses. AI systems handled tasks once performed by administrative workers, customer service teams, and analysts. Even creative and professional fields felt the impact. AI wrote code. AI drafted documents. AI analyzed data. AI created images and generated video. For the first time, automation did not simply replace physical labor. It began replacing cognitive labor, challenging the long-held belief that education alone could guarantee stability. The sixth shift was political and cultural tension. Debates exploded over economic fairness, racial inequality, public health, and the role of government. The middle class found itself caught in the middle of polarized narratives. Some demanded stronger social safety nets, affordable health care, and expanded support for working families. Others pushed for deregulation, lower taxes, and individual choice. The struggle over the future of the American middle class became a defining political battle. The seventh shift was mental and emotional. The pandemic exposed the fragility of work-life balance and the pressures of modern living. Stress, burnout, and anxiety rose sharply. Families faced new challenges in childcare, schooling, and caregiving. The middle class was not only fighting economic battles, but emotional ones. Yet despite the turmoil, something remarkable happened. The American middle class adapted. Again, just as it had in the 1930s, in the 1970s, in the early 2000s, and during every moment of national crisis. People reinvented themselves. Workers learned new skills. Businesses moved online. Families restructured budgets. Communities supported one another. Millions launched small online shops. Millions built freelance careers. Millions embraced remote work as a permanent lifestyle. Millions invested in new tools, new technologies, and new ways to earn. The middle class proved once again that it was not defined by its challenges, but by its resilience. By the mid-2020s, a new reality was taking shape. The workplace was hybrid, the economy was digital, education was flexible, healthcare was evolving, housing remained a challenge, but new cities and new regions were rising. Technology was advancing faster than ever, and through it all, one truth became clear. The American middle class was not disappearing. It was transforming, shifting from stability to adaptability, from tradition to innovation, from a single model of economic life to many different models coexisting at once. The dream did not vanish, it evolved. In the next chapter, we complete this journey. We look at what lies ahead, the opportunities, the dangers, and the choices that will determine whether the middle class remains the beating heart of the American dream or becomes a relic of the past. As the story of American wealth moves into the present and looks toward the future, one truth rises above all others. The middle class has never been a static group. It has been built, broken, rebuilt, reshaped, and reinvented through every era of American history. From the factories of the early 1900s to the suburbs of the 1950s, to the global economy of the 1990s and the digital world of the 2020s, the middle class has remained the beating heart of the nation. But with every generation, the forces shaping the American dream have changed. And now in the 21st century, the question is no longer how the middle class was created. We have traveled through that story. The question is, what will sustain it in the decades ahead? The future of the American middle class will depend on 5 major forces, each powerful, each unpredictable, and each capable of transforming life for millions of families. The first force is technology. Artificial intelligence, automation, robotics, and digital tools are advancing at unprecedented speed. Jobs that once felt secure now face uncertainty. Routine work in offices, factories, and service industries is increasingly handled by algorithms and machines. But new opportunities are rising as well. Entire industries are emerging around data software, green energy, biotechnology, and creative digital work. The challenge for the middle class will be adaptation. The ability to learn new skills, shift careers, and embrace technologies that redefine what work means. For generations, the middle class was built on stability. Now it will be built on adaptability. The second force is education. Not just traditional education, but lifelong learning. The old model, a degree at 22, followed by one career until retirement, is fading. The future demands constant upgrading, continuous training, and new forms of knowledge. Online learning will play a major role. Short courses, certifications, digital apprenticeships, and self-paced programs will allow millions to pivot careers without returning to expensive universities. The middle class will belong to those who can learn quickly and reinvent themselves when the world changes. The third force is housing. For decades, home ownership was the engine of middle-class wealth. But rising prices, limited supply, and geographic inequality have made owning a home a challenge for many families. The future will depend on new housing models, multi-generational homes, zoned density, smaller urban units, new suburban development, and cities that embrace affordable building solutions. Remote work may ease these pressures by spreading populations across the country and reducing dependence on a few high-priced metros. Housing will remain the cornerstone of financial security, but how Americans build, buy, and live will continue evolving. The fourth force is economic inequality. The gap between those who thrive and those who struggle has grown wider over the past 40 years. Wages for many workers have stagnated. Costs for healthcare, education, housing, and childcare have risen. The middle class is increasingly pressured from both ends by declining job stability and rising household expenses. The future will depend on policy decisions, corporate choices, and societal priorities that determine whether prosperity is shared or concentrated. The story of the American middle class has always been shaped by decisions: the New Deal, the GI Bill Union, protections, suburban development, educational expansion. Future decisions will matter just as deeply. The fifth force is culture. For decades, the middle class was defined by a shared identity, home ownership, steady work, family life, and belief in upward mobility. Today, that identity is fragmenting. Some families embrace remote work and digital careers. Others rely on traditional trades and local economies. Some prioritize minimalism and mobility. Others seek stability and long-term roots. The American dream is no longer one story. It is many stories coexisting, each shaped by opportunity or struggle, privilege, or barriers, innovation, or disruption. The future middle class will not look like the past, but it can still be strong, vibrant, and central to national life. Because despite economic turbulence, technological disruption, and political division, one fact above all remains true: the American middle class is built on resilience. It grew from factory workers seeking dignity. It expanded through veterans building homes and families. It evolved through women entering the workforce and reshaping society. It adapted through crises, inventions, booms, and recessions. Every generation faced challenges that seemed impossible, and every generation found a way to keep going. The middle class did not survive because conditions were easy. It survived because Americans refused to let go of the belief that life should be better tomorrow than it is today. And that belief, more than any policy, any paycheck, any possession, is the true engine of the American dream. As the nation moves forward, the middle class stands at a crossroads. One path leads to stagnation, inequality, and fragmentation. The other leads to renewal, innovation, and opportunity. The outcome is not predetermined. It will be decided by choices individual, collective, and national, by how Americans work, by how they learn, by how they adapt, by how they treat each other, by whether they invest in the future or retreat into fear. The story of the American middle class is not over. It is entering a new chapter, one that has yet to be written, and the authors of that chapter will not be corporations, economists, or politicians. They will be ordinary families, parents trying to build stability, young people seeking opportunity, workers reinventing their skills, communities finding new ways to thrive, just as they have for more than a century. The American middle class was never guaranteed. It was created through struggle, vision, and determination. And its future, its next great chapter, will be shaped by the same spirit that carried it from the factories of the industrial age to the digital world of today. A spirit rooted in resilience, fueled by hope, driven by belief. The belief that ordinary people, given opportunity, can build extraordinary lives. The belief that wealth is not only measured in dollars, but in dignity, security, community, and the promise of a better future. The belief that the American dream still matters, and that it is worth fighting for.